Hey guys, tonight we're travelling back to the Middle Ages, where sex was everywhere except where it was allowed to be. This is a time when priests wrote rulebooks that banned just about every form of physical pleasure, from touching yourself to looking vaguely pleased with your spouse. And still, humans being humans, people found plenty of creative ways to do it anyway. You're about to walk straight into a world of medieval morality, where what's written on the church door isn't necessarily what's happening behind the barn. You probably won't survive this. Like if you were really living in 1350, one misstep with the wrong person or one whisper of gossip could land you in a shaming parade. Or worse, a freezing prison cell with a rat named Geoffrey and a priest yelling about your loins. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I know it's late, drop your city and what time it is where you're watching from in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes in the middle of a chilly stone church. It smells like damp wood and old incense. There's a priest up front, dramatically pacing before a small gathering of townsfolk. His robes are a bit too clean, his hair oddly well kept. He's reciting something, not scripture exactly, but a set of rules. You lean in, curious, as he declares, "Sex within marriage must never be for pleasure, only for procreation, and never on Sundays, or feast days, or fast days, or during Lent or Advent, or... Your eyebrows lift. That's a lot of no-go days. You mentally tally it up. Ad days are once a week, obviously. Feast days, at least 50 per year. Lent and Advent span weeks. If you took all this literally, couples had maybe 90 days a year to get it on. And even then, only in missionary position, and only if you didn't enjoy it too much. The priest doesn't say that last part aloud, but it's implied in the grim way he says the word pleasure, like it's a scorpion that's snuck into his stew. But here's the thing. After the sermon, people walk out chatting, smirking. One older woman actually chuckles and nudges her friend. There's a glint in her eye that says she's heard the rules, sure, but back home, there's a husband with a jug of mead and a blanket by the hearth. You follow her down the dirt path toward her cottage and catch little snippets of conversation. He says it's a sin. But didn't I see Brother Thomas smiling awful wide behind the stable last Sunday? Someone snickers. This is the gap, right here, between what the church thundered down from the pulpit and what real medieval people actually did behind closed doors. The church's influence was enormous, sure, but so were people's desires, needs, and very human habits. And for all the preaching about chastity and restraint, the system was oddly forgiving, if you had the right coin. There were, believe it or not, official price lists for sins. Caught having sex during Lent. Pay a fine and say a few prayers, confess to more inventive sins. That'll cost extra, but don't worry, forgiveness is absolutely for sale. Now let's get a little weird, because the medieval world wasn't just black and white, rule versus rebellion. There were some genuinely bizarre facts hiding in the fine print of morality. For example, in some places, it was believed that children conceived during certain holy times would be born physically deformed or spiritually cursed. There were even tales that babies made during menstruation would be born with devilish tails, hairy hands, you name it. Obviously, none of that holds up to, science. But in the 1300s, these stories packed real weight. You wouldn't want to be the midwife delivering a child with a birthmark during Easter week. Even stranger? There were debates, real scholarly arguments, over what counted as sex. In certain texts, only full penetration between a married man and woman for the purpose of making a child was considered actual sex. Everything else, foreplay, oral sex, same-sex intimacy, even masturbation, all were seen as more sinful in some circles than vanilla adultery, because they didn't lead to reproduction. Some theologians, like Thomas Aquinas, drew detailed hierarchies of sin that honestly read like very judgy fan fiction. And yet despite all this institutional obsession with purity, people kept doing what people always do, finding loopholes, making exceptions, and sometimes just ignoring the rules outright. You walk into a small cottage and spot a young couple eating bread and honey, leaning into each other, hands not even pretending to behave. There's a worn leather booklet tucked under the hearth, likely a penitential filled with listed sins and their required penance. You peek at a page. "Thou who mounteth from behind shall fast for 40 days. You blink. Flip the page. "He who layeth with his wife unclothed, 7 days penance." Seriously? But instead of shame, you get the sense that this booklet is more like a strange cookbook, something you refer to occasionally, but not the authority it's supposed to be. People knew the rules, they just didn't always follow them, and when they confessed, they did so like customers at a medieval car wash. Get a little dirty, pay a few coins, emerge fresh and forgiven, ready to sin again by Thursday. There's a kind of practical realism to it all. The church set high ideals, sure, but no one, including clergy, really lived up to them. In fact, some historians argue that these impossible standards had to be impossible. Why? Because it kept the people guilty, and guilty people were controllable. If everyone believed they were always falling short, they were more likely to keep confessing, paying penance, and staying inside the church's long shadow. You head out into the chill again as twilight gathers over the village. A rooster crows, confused. Somewhere a baby cries. And back in the church another sermon begins. Same warnings, same fire and brimstone. But you've seen enough now to know the truth. The rules were real, yes, but the real lives people lived? A different story entirely. So here's the thing, you've made it to the next village over and already something's off. You wander past a narrow alley behind the chapel and nearly bump into a young man tying up his laces a little too fast, looking like he just sprinted from somewhere compromising. There's a girl ducking out the other end, cheeks flushed, hair messy, dress twisted at the waist. Neither of them looks particularly remorseful. And it's Wednesday, noon to be exact. You remember that because the church bells are going wild like they're trying to interrupt the climax. Literally, you chuckle to yourself, because according to the official calendar of medieval sex rules, this little rendezvous just broke, let's say, a long list of rules. Not just premarital sex, which was obviously frowned upon, but sex during daylight hours, on a Wednesday, and possibly during a fasting season, depending on what year this is. You squint at a nearby almanac scratched into a wooden plaque. Yep, fasting week. That means no meat, no sex, and technically no bathing either. But here these two are, glowing like someone just handed them a warm pie and said, "Congrats on sinning." See? The medieval church didn't just ban some times for sex, it banned most of them. You weren't supposed to have sex during Lent, which is 40 days, Advent, another 40-ish, on feast days over C per year, Sundays because Sabbath, Fridays because Jesus died on a Friday, before communion often weekly, during a woman's period, or while pregnant, or, hilariously, for 40 days after childbirth. Add all that up, and you're left with maybe 90 permissible days per year for marital sex. Maybe, and even then, missionary only, no talking, lights off, please don't enjoy it too much. Of course, none of that stopped people. In fact, the more complicated the rules became, the more people shrugged and said, yeah, nah. You notice a housewife drawing a chalk calendar in the dust on her doorframe. Red marks for no sex days. There are so many, the few green light days look like forgotten scraps of hope. She sighs, wipes her hands on her apron and mutters, "He never remembers anyway." Her tone says she's more annoyed than repentant. And here's a weird twist. Some people tried to obey. They really did. But the church had such a bizarre obsession with micromanaging intimacy that they created contradictions people couldn't escape. For example, couples were encouraged to be fruitful and multiply, but also told to abstain from sex during all the times when, biologically speaking, a woman was most likely to conceive. Scientists and historians have pointed out this paradox. Was the goal really reproduction, or was it control disguised as piety? Let's get even quirkier. There were priests, yes, actual priests, who compiled entire calendars warning sober people when it was safe to have sex. Some even made hand-illustrated charts colour-coded for sin severity. One especially dramatic guide warned that conceiving a child during Lent could result in a baby born with a limp, or worse, an evil disposition. It's not that they knew how reproduction worked. They mostly just threw moral darts at the wall and called it divine insight. And then you've got the loophole crowd. Let's say it's a no-sex day, but you're feeling frisky. What do? You compromise. Maybe you just sleep next to your spouse and let God's will decide if anything happens. Maybe you do a little more, but rationalise it with, we're not trying for pleasure, just practising our vows. You laugh when you hear a baker whisper that exact line to his wife after slapping flour on her behind. She smirks, but doesn't argue. There were also regional differences. What was scandalous in Paris might be tolerated in Florence. A bishop in England might condemn sex on holy days, while a French abbot just sort of winked and said, "Try not to make noise." And in rural areas, far from clerical oversight, people made up their own hybrid rules, like don't do it in the church, but the hayloft is fair game. You stroll past a barn with suspicious noises leaking through the cracks and decide not to knock. The scholarly debate around these rules is juicy too. Some historians argue that the church never really expected people to follow all these restrictions. The point wasn't obedience, it was guilt. If everyone was always in a state of sins, everyone always needed forgiveness. That meant more confessions, more penance, more power to the church. Others disagree, saying the laws were sincere, if misguided, an attempt to create a spiritual structure for physical urges. Still, the contradiction is hilarious. There are records, real ones, of priests warning people not to have sex during Lent, then quietly fathering children in the rectory. Some monasteries had entire secret systems for managing their lovers. In a few places, they even built nunneries next to brothels, thinking the women would convert. Spoiler alert, they didn't. If anything, they traded tips. You sit by a well and listen to three older women gossiping. One tells the story of a couple caught having sex on a saint's feast day and sentenced to a week of fasting on barley and water. Didn't stop them, she says. They just moved the bed to the cellar. Another adds, Old Agnes swears her boy was born on the Virgin's Day and grew up to steal every chicken in town. Says it's because she made love on a holy hour. They all cackle. Later that evening, you stroll into the parish again. The priest is droning on about St. Paul and bodily restraint. He emphasises how sex, even within marriage, should never be about desire. You glance around. Half the congregation is dozing. One guy near the back is holding hands with his wife, sneaking a thumb caress under her sleeve. You wonder how many of these folks will be repenting tomorrow for things they never intended to stop doing. And honestly, that's the real story here. It's not just that the rules existed, it's that they were so out of step with reality that people had to invent their own quiet resistance. Behind every official edict was a village full of couples figuring out how to follow the spirit of the law, if not the letter, or just how to ignore both entirely with plausible deniability. You finish the day in a cramped tavern lit with smoky oil lamps. Someone's playing a lute, and two drunk farmers are arguing about whether St. Valentine actually liked women. You lean back, sip some rough wine and realise it's Wednesday, it's Lent, and half this place smells like sex and sausage. You grin. Church calendar be damned. You wake up on a hard wooden bench, your back aching in that special way only medieval furniture can manage. Sunlight filters in through stained glass windows above you, painting the stone floor in blurry red and blue halos. You're in the church again, because apparently you have a thing for irony. And up front to a shab, the same priest from yesterday is back at it, waving his arms like a man battling invisible bees. He's sweating through his robe, his voice is tight with urgency. He's not preaching today though, he's warning, this isn't your average sex is bad rant. No, this is a full-blown spiritual meltdown. The topic, lust, unclean thoughts, nocturnal emissions. You blink. Did he just say that out loud? He did. The devil comes in dreams, he bellows, slipping into the sleeping mind, planting filthy desires in your soul. The congregation is unusually quiet. No coughing, no babies crying, just the rustle of clothes and one dramatic gasp from a woman who definitely knew that this speech was coming. You lean back, watching his hands tremble as he grabs the pulpit for balance. His voice cracks on the next line. I myself have battled the flesh, have cried out to the Lord in the darkness as the serpent tempted me. You wince, overshare, way overshare. The room shifts uncomfortably. You're not the only one realising that this isn't so much a warning for the people as it is a confession from the priest. And that's something no one ever really tells you about medieval moral authorities. They were often just as tangled in the web of guilt and lust as the people they were preaching to, maybe even more so, especially when you consider how unnatural their expectations were. Celibacy for life in your 20s, while living around farmers' daughters, tavern wenches and travelling musicians, not to mention monks, nuns, scribes and choir boys. Good luck. The priest is sweating bullets now, his words spill faster, more desperate. We must beat the body like St. Benedict did. He flung himself into thorn bushes to resist temptation. A few people nod, but most are just staring. The man in the second pew has gone pale. A teenage boy near the back is grinning ear to ear. You're realising, with a kind of gentle horror, that this is not the first time this priest has gone off script. Historically, this kind of spiritual spiral wasn't that unusual. Monks and priests, especially those isolated in rural parishes or cloisters, often suffered intense guilt over their sexual urges. Some wrote letters to other clergy begging for advice. Some even chronicled their failures in graphic detail, creating bizarre and deeply uncomfortable records that survive in dusty library archives to this day. One famously tortured monk confessed to having lustful dreams about the Virgin Mary, twice, and flagellated himself with a thorned switch. Another claimed he had impure thoughts about a statue of an angel. No one knows quite what he meant by that. And here's the quirky fringe fact for this moment. There were real debates about whether dreams counted as sin. Like, legally. Theologians spent entire treatises debating if a nocturnal emission, what they called a pollution, was a sign of hidden vice or just a bodily accident. Some said it was the devil poking your soul while you slept. Others, more grounded, argued it was natural and not sinful unless enjoyed. Enjoyed. Imagine being questioned about how much you liked your dream. You can't make this stuff up. Actually, someone did. And then it became doctrine. As the priest continues his very public breakdown, you wander outside for some air. The church bell tower casts a long shadow across the graveyard. You sit on a stone ledge, wondering what it must have been like to live constantly afraid of your own biology. People were taught that desire itself was dangerous, that arousal was proof of spiritual weakness. Not just temptation, but possession. For priests it was worse. Their whole identity rested on remaining celibate, holy, above the mess. And yet many didn't last a month. There's a quiet scandal playing out behind the church, literally. You spot the laundress, a round-cheeked woman in her 40s, whispering with the younger deacon. She hands him a folded cloth. He touches her wrist just a beat too long. You're not judging, well, maybe a little, but the tension is thick. This isn't sin, this is survival. Loneliness, need, and maybe a dash of defiance. Here's where the open debate comes in. Historians still can't agree on how celibate medieval clergy actually were. Some sources say widespread corruption, priests keeping concubines, even common families right in the rectory. Others claim that these stories were exaggerated by enemies of the church or later Protestant reformers trying to discredit Catholic authority. The truth, as usual, is probably in the messy middle. Some resisted, some failed, some didn't try at all, and got very good at pretending. Back inside the church, the priest is winding down. His voice is raw, his eyes are glassy. "Pray for me," he says hoarsely, "for I too am flesh." That's the closest thing to a real moment you've heard from him. For all the fire and brimstone, what lingers is the vulnerability. You think about how many people, priests and layfolk alike, must have sat in these pews over the centuries, terrified by what they felt, by what they wanted. And how much of that fear was planted by sermons like this? Later that evening you slip into the tavern where some of the villagers have gathered. They're buzzing with gossip. "Did you hear him?" a miller's wife says. "Sweating like a pig in June." Another snorts. "I'd wager he was dreaming of Marcy, the baker's daughter." "Saw the way he looked at her at the solstice fair." Someone mimics the priest's hand-wringing. Laughter erupts, but beneath the laughter is something else. Relief. Relief that the holy man is just as human as everyone else. That behind the robes and rituals he's struggling too. Maybe that means the rest of them aren't damned either. You finish your drink, step outside into the cool night, and let the wind pass over your skin. You close your eyes, listening to the sounds of a world forever trying and often failing to live up to the rules it wrote for itself. The confession booth is musty, dimly lit, and smells vaguely of dried lavender and regret. You slide the wooden partition aside just a little, peeking into the carved space where thousands of whispered sins have poured out over centuries. Today, it's your turn to sit still and listen, because tonight you're not the sinner, you're the fly on the wall. And what you're about to overhear will make every dusty sermon you've endured seem like a bedtime lullaby. A woman enters the confessional, eyes lowered, veil damp with nervous sweat. She's probably no older than 30, though her face is already lined from farm labour and childbearing. She kneels, mutters a prayer, and then silence. Long, anxious silence. Then comes the whisper, barely audible. "Father, I allowed my husband to enter me while I was on my courses." You blink. That's period sex for those playing along at home. She waits, breath caught, for the priest's reaction. The priest exhales slowly, clearly having heard much worse. "Did you both consent?" he asks. She nods. He mutters something about 40 days of penance, light fasting, 3 extra prayers. Not a harsh judgment, but the shame radiating from her posture is palpable. She rises slowly, thanks him, and shuffles away like she's leaving a courtroom. Then a young man enters. He's cocky, smirking before the partition even slides shut. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I lay with Agnes, the brewer's daughter, outside of wedlock." The priest sighs heavily. "Was it just once?" The man hesitates. "Thrice, in the hayloft, on St. Eustace's Day." The priest groans. "You do realise that's a feast day?" The man grins. "Didn't feel very holy." You stifle a laugh, but here's where things get oddly systematic. The priest doesn't rage or moralise. He pulls out a little book, a penitential, one of the many mini manuals used to assign sins their going rate. It's like a medieval menu of damnation. Masturbation, 2 weeks of fasting. Adultery, 7 years if unconfessed, 3 if confessed. Sex with someone of the same sex. Don't ask. Just know the punishment's brutal, but also negotiable depending on your class, your charm, or whether the priest is in a particularly tired mood. This is the strange duality of confession in the Middle Ages. It was deeply serious, but also transactional. People came in, listed their sins, often with shocking specificity, and walked out with a spiritual receipt. Confession was mandatory at least once a year under church law, and for many it was a mix of spiritual cleansing and awkward formality, like an annual tax on desire. You wonder how many people sat here confessing not because they truly felt guilt, but because not confessing was worse. Socially, spiritually, sometimes even legally. Now here comes the fringe moment. A woman steps in, voice shaking, and admits to using a love charm, an herbal mixture she smeared on her inner thighs to arouse her husband. The priest gasps. Love magic was technically a sin, veering into the territory of witchcraft, but it's also absurdly common. Women, especially those in rural areas, passed these recipes down like family heirlooms. Some used mugwort, others fennel or a mandrake. All meant to enhance desire or, let's be honest, just to get a tired husband interested again. Or ward off rivals, or ensure the husband stayed only interested in her. Depending on the ingredients, a charm could be considered harmless folk medicine, or outright demonic. The priest in this case takes a deep breath and says, "No more herbs, pray to St. Anne instead." St. Anne, by the way, was believed to help with fertility and marital harmony, which in medieval terms is code for bedroom cooperation. You step outside the booth and wander into the side chamber where confession records are occasionally scribbled down in code or shorthand. One faded scroll reads like the weirdest diary entry you've ever seen. Today, a shepherd confessed to knowing his neighbour's wife carnally in the sheepfold. Twice. She claimed to be bewitched. He denied magic, said it was the weather. Another note. A monk admitted to impure thoughts during morning prayers, suggested fasting but asked for fish. It's easy to laugh, but this was real and revealing. Confessions offer historians some of the only direct, unfiltered insights into what people were really doing behind closed doors. The rules said one thing, but the confessions show a deeply human, deeply flawed, and often deeply funny reality. Even priests admitted their failures. Some went so far as to confess to other priests, creating a sin feedback loop that, frankly, sounds like it needed therapy long before therapy was invented. Here's the open scholarly debate, though. How much of these confessions were sincere, and how much were performative? Some historians argue that people exaggerated their sins to appear humble, or to manipulate the priest's pity. Others say they downplayed the worst parts to avoid harsher penance. And still others believe many simply invented sins d'amour to have something to confess, because going in empty-handed made you look arrogant. You take a final look around the church, watching people exit with lighter steps. There's something oddly comforting about this whole system. Messy, yes. Hypocritical, often. But it offered structure, ritual, a rhythm to guilt and forgiveness. Sin, confess, penance, repeat. A divine laundromat, if you will. Get dirty, pay the price, come out spiritually pressed and folded, ready to mess it all up again by market day. On your way out, you pass a boy, maybe 12, shuffling nervously toward the booth. He clutches a small wooden cross and mutters under his breath. You can just barely catch it. I saw the blacksmith's wife bathing in the stream and I didn't look away. His cheeks are red. He's clearly terrified, but honestly, you're not. Because in a world where nearly every thought or twitch could be labelled sinful, it's not a surprise he's here. It's a surprise anyone isn't. Outside, the sun is setting over the village roofs, casting the streets in golden slants of light. The smell of roasting meat drifts from a hearth nearby, and you hear the slow chime of evening bells. Another day of rules broken, confessions mumbled, forgiveness granted. You walk down the road, not particularly redeemed, but definitely a little more informed about what went on in the shadows of faith. Spoiler, it was rarely holy. You duck into a stable just before the rain hits. The first fat drops slap the thatch roof like impatient knuckles, and the air thickens with that earthy smell of wet straw, manure and horse sweat. It's not glamorous, but it's real, and as you settle onto an overturned bucket in the corner, you start to notice something else. The stable isn't empty. In the loft above, there's a soft giggle, then a muffled grunt, then silence, the kind that says, "We've been caught." A young couple peers over the edge, her hair mussed, his shirt inside out. They freeze. You give them a small nod, the kind that says, "Your secret's safe," and they relax. Welcome to the unofficial bedrooms of medieval Europe. Barns, stables, haylofts, forests, storage sheds, even graveyards. Anywhere with a little privacy and no clergy in earshot. Because here's the truth no one carved into the cathedral walls. The majority of people in medieval Europe didn't have bedrooms, or if they did, they weren't private. Whole families often slept in the same room, sometimes even in the same bed. Parents, children, maybe a servant or two, all arranged like spoons in a drawer. Not exactly the atmosphere for intimacy. So couples, especially the unmarried ones, had to get creative. A hayloft became a honeymoon suite. A quiet corner of the vineyard turned into a rendezvous spot. The forest? Sure, if you didn't mind the wolves and the occasional wandering monk. You follow the couple outside after the rain eases, and they don't seem the least bit ashamed. In fact, the boy, probably 19, grins as he adjusts his belt. "Better than the priest's bed," he mutters. His companion slaps his arm, but she's laughing. It's a little moment of rebellion, yes, but also survival. These are poor folk. They don't have dowries or formal betrothals. Marriage in this world is a negotiation as much as a sacrament, and sex is part of that conversation. Here's where it gets historical. The church tried really hard to stamp out what it called fornication, especially among the lower classes. But courts across Europe were flooded with cases that showed people weren't exactly waiting for wedding bells. There's one infamous record from 14th century England where a couple was fined for having sex in a church porch. Their defence? "We were betrothed, so it was as good as marriage." The court half agreed. The fine was reduced. Romantic? Not really. But extremely medieval? Absolutely. The quirky part is, there were entire customs around premarital sex, especially in rural villages. In some regions, it was expected that engaged couples would sleep together before marriage, as a kind of trial run. There were even ceremonial beds set up for it, with witnesses. If the woman became pregnant, the marriage was fast-tracked. If she didn't, sometimes the match was broken off. You're not sure whether to be horrified or impressed by the practicality. And that hayloft? It wasn't just used by secret lovers. In harvest season, it doubled as a crash pad for seasonal workers. Many rural employers turned a blind eye to the late-night sounds filtering through the beams. "Better they do it here than in the bishop's vineyard," one farmer shrugs as you pass him stacking barley. He clearly knows what his barn is being used for. Now let's talk logistics. You stop by a small alehouse later that evening, and the barmaid, sharp-eyed, gap-toothed, leans in with gossip. "Saw young Thomas with Millie in the grain mill last night. Thought the ghost would get 'em. But no, just a flower on their backs." She laughs like it's the best joke she's heard all week. "That mill's seen more passion than the castle bedchambers, I reckon." She's not wrong. Mills, with their steady creak and turn, were favourite trysting spots. Convenient, noisy, and far from town gossip if you timed it right. And while we're in a miller's world, you should know, the church didn't love this. But enforcement was patchy at best. There simply weren't enough officials to patrol every barn, every hedgerow, every moment two teenagers made eyes over a loaf of rye. So instead, the church used fear. They preached that sex outside of marriage would stain your soul, ruin your future children, attract demons, and curse your crops. But again, when your crop is already cursed and demons feel like the least of your problems, it's hard to get worked up about sin. Here's where scholars start to debate. Was this really rebellion, or just people surviving within a broken system? Some argue that the poor weren't ignoring church law. They simply lived in a reality where those rules didn't apply. The structure of marriage was often delayed due to economics. No money for a dowry, no land to inherit, no roof to shelter a wife. So sex came first because love and bodies don't wait for legal documents. Others argue that people did take the rules seriously but just couldn't live up to them, and so they confessed, paid and tried again. Wash, rinse, repeat. You step out of the alehouse and wander toward a cottage. A couple sits outside drinking weak cider by firelight. You hear them talking about their first time together. She was 16, he 18. "Behind the granary," she says with a smile. "We weren't even promised yet, just couldn't help it." They both chuckle, then fall silent. There's no shame in their voices, only nostalgia. That's when it hits you. This was love, however rough and rustic and rule-breaking it looked. Not always romantic, not always kind, but human. Not every barn encounter was mutual, of course, and there's a darker side to this story that we'll get to. But here, in this moment, it's clear that even under the weight of church law, class restrictions and cultural fear, people still found ways to be close, to touch, to share a stolen hour under the eaves. The hay still smells of rain. Somewhere, an owl hoots. You lean against the fence looking out at the dark fields beyond. It's not quiet. Not really. The land hums with insects, wind, life, and maybe that's the point. The church could write all the rules it wanted. But out here, away from the cathedrals and courts, life moved to a different rhythm. One ruled less by saints and more by bodies, aching, flawed, warm, and persistent. You find yourself seated on a creaky bench in the back of a tiny chapel library, flipping through a book that at first glance looks innocent, just dusty old Latin on yellowing parchment. But as you skim the entries, you quickly realise this isn't a Bible. It's a penitential, a list of sins with their corresponding punishments, the medieval version of a price guide for your moral failures. And wow, the people who wrote this were thorough, uncomfortably thorough. Take this gem, for example. He who performs the act of copulation in the manner of dogs shall fast for 30 days on bread and water. You blink, flip the page. If a man lies with his wife while she is standing, both must do penance for 10 days. Standing. That's specific. And how would anyone even know? You glance around the room like someone might be watching you read it. The air feels dense with old guilt. This, my friend, is the medieval sin list game, an entire genre of church literature designed to catalogue human depravity in such exquisite detail that you have to assume at least some of the authors had experience. These books, often written by monks, weren't meant to be read aloud in polite company, but priests and confessors used them as rulebooks for assigning penance, like spiritual accountants tallying up your lustful deductions. And the sins weren't limited to just the usual suspects. Oh no, these lists went deep. Sex in daylight, sin, sex while naked, sin, sex while smiling, definitely a sin. One entry flat out states, if he enjoys the act with undue delight, let him fast for 40 days. Undue delight. You sigh, so even if you were married, sober, and using the correct position, you still had to look deeply bored about it or risk spiritual consequences. The strangest part, these manuals also reveal just how aware the church was of what people were doing, because you can't make up this many scenarios unless you've been hearing about them. Again and again and again, like one entry reads, if a man lies with his wife in the same bed after the act, he must sleep apart the following night in penance. You look up, baffled. Not only could you not enjoy the act, you couldn't even snuggle afterward. Apparently post-coital cuddling was a slippery slope to hell. And the loopholes? Oh, there were so many. Because when you write down this many rules, people inevitably start gaming the system. You picture a medieval couple in candlelight debating whether it still counts as a sin if you don't finish, or if it's not quite intercourse but still involved, or if one of you is technically asleep but mutters amen halfway through. These were the spiritual grey areas, and plenty of people squinted hard at the rulebook to find them. Now here's where things get really wild. Some penitentials ranked sins in a way that to modern ears makes zero sense. For example, masturbation often carried a harsher penance than straight-up adultery. Same-sex intimacy? Usually punished more severely than incest. And certain acts, like receiving oral sex, were considered worse than giving it. Which, okay, that raises a lot of follow-up questions, but more than anything, it shows how the system prioritised intent over harm. Were you trying to make a baby? No. Then it was probably sinful. One particularly fringe entry comes from a 9th century Irish penitential, which warned against embracing with too much familiarity or kissing the eyes of one's wife. The eyes? You stare at the parchment. That's not just a sin, that's poetry. But again, the implication was that even small acts of intimacy could ignite lust, and lust was the gateway drug to hell. As you read, a monk walks by and glances at the open book. "Useful?" he asks. In a tone that sounds half joking, half morbidly curious, you nod slowly. There's a lot to take in. He chuckles and mutters, "Aye, they say Brother Michael added a few lines of his own." You raise an eyebrow. Personal experience? The monk just shrugs and walks off, humming a Pamushka hymn. You keep reading. One section lists the penance for bestiality. Turns out the sin level changes depending on which animal was involved. Horses, high penalty, chickens, weirdly low. Which leads to the awkward but necessary conclusion. Someone out there was documenting which animals people were choosing, and someone else decided to make a moral pricing chart for it. You close the book for a moment and just stare at the candle. This is the open scholarly debate of the day. Were these books meant to be taken literally, or were they more like cautionary tales? Spiritual fan fiction, if you will. Some historians argue that very few people were ever actually punished for these things. The books were more about setting a gold standard of purity, even if no one could meet it. Others think they were deadly serious, used to guilt, shame and control people into constant confession, and of course paying fees, because yes, many of these penances could be commuted, i.e. replaced with money. Couldn't fast for 40 days, pay a silver coin, didn't feel like sleeping apart from your wife. Leave a generous offering. Confession and forgiveness were, quite literally, part of the economy. As the afternoon sun angles through the dusty window panes, you flip to one last page, an especially odd list of sins and penances scribbled into the margin. Some don't even make sense. If a man licks honey from his wife's navel with intent to arouse, let him abstain from meat for 7 days. Another one. If she mounts him like a man, and both are pleased, let them kneel in sackcloth at dawn. You stare at the word pleased, always that word. Eventually you set the book down. It's too much, even for a curious mind. You realise something essential. These rules weren't just designed to punish, they were designed to overwhelm. To keep people feeling constantly watched, judged, and unsure. Because when guilt becomes the default, obedience becomes easier. And when you start to believe your own desires are shameful, every thought, every touch, you're more likely to hand your morality over to someone else. You leave the chapel quietly, slipping into the deep blue of early evening. There's laughter in the village square, a child chasing a dog, a woman calling her husband home for dinner. Life, imperfect and loud and messy, goes on. No lists, no parchment, just real people breaking rules in all the ways that make them human. It's just past midnight when you arrive at the outskirts of a small town drawn by the flicker of torches and the low, tense murmur of voices. Something's happening, something secretive and probably scandalous, given that it's happening at this hour. You follow the shadows down a narrow lane until you reach the back courtyard of the local magistrate's house. A few town officials are gathered in a tight circle, cloaks pulled close, brows furrowed. At their centre stands a young couple, barefoot, shivering slightly, their hands bound loosely with a strip of linen. They look like they've just been dragged out of bed. That's not far off. Tonight you've stumbled into a medieval night court, and yes, those were a thing. Not as dramatic as they sound, no gavel, no powdered wigs, but when it came to matters of sex, towns often dealt with infractions quickly and quietly, especially when it involved someone's reputation, someone's property, or most often both. Because remember, in this world, sex isn't just personal, it's social, legal, theological, and deeply public business. The local reeve, a pot-bellied man with a wheezy voice, raises a finger. These two were caught fornicating behind the tannery during a holy vigil. A murmur goes through the gathered men. The town priest crosses himself. One of the councillors mutters, "Of all the nights." The young woman stares at the ground, her cheeks burning. The boy's mouth tightens, but he says nothing. This is what happened when real behaviour clashed head-on with religious law. The church said no sex outside marriage, The town said, well, maybe just don't get caught, but if you were caught, punishment had to be delivered, and often in ways that were less about justice and more about humiliation. The priest steps forward, his voice trembling slightly with righteous indignation, or perhaps just annoyance at being woken up. "What say you in defence?" he asks. The girl speaks, her voice barely above a whisper. "We meant no harm. We are promised to marry." The boy nods quickly. "We only sought to prove our love. We did not mean to shame God." A solid effort. You can practically hear the desperate shuffle toward plausible piety, and surprisingly it works, to a degree. The Reeve glances at the others. So they're promised. He chews his lip, clearly torn between two forces, moral enforcement and the logistical pain of punishing two otherwise decent townsfolk for a moment of shared hormones. That's where things get creative. Instead of whipping or jailing, which would be costly and risk community backlash, the court orders something different. Public penance through performance. Tomorrow, at the town square, the couple will be dressed in plain linen shifts, flower crowns on their heads, and forced to walk hand in hand around the market while singing hymns about chastity. 3 full laps. No shoes. You blink. That's oddly wholesome and deeply embarrassing. But here's the thing. Theatrical punishments were often favoured over severe ones, especially in small towns. Stocks, shame parades, forced vigils, these were designed not just to punish, but to display moral correction. The goal was less about reforming the sinner, and more about reminding everyone else what the boundaries were. It was sex education via public theatre, humiliation as policy. You follow the couple home, where their mothers are already waiting, both whisper yelling in that way only disappointed mothers can. During vigil, one hisses. In the open, the other adds, you could have waited until Michaelmas. But there's a strange lack of real fury. In truth, everyone knows this sort of thing happens. It's only a problem because it's visible. And that's the historical fact for tonight. Enforcement of sex laws was wildly inconsistent. 2 lovers might be caught and fined in one town, while in another the same act might be ignored completely, or punished harshly depending on who saw it and who was involved. Nobles could often bribe their way out of trouble. Peasants might be let off with a warning if no one complained. But if your actions sparked gossip, scandal, or the ire of someone important, then suddenly your bedroom became a courtroom. There's a recorded case from 1327 in York where a couple was fined for lying carnally in the churchyard. The penalty wasn't prison. It was standing in front of the church the next Sunday, wearing a wooden yoke and a sign that read, "I broke the holy ground with unholy acts." Mild by modern standards, but enough to ruin someone's marriage prospects for years. Now here's the fringe fact. In some towns, sin watchers were a real thing. Volunteers, usually older women or widowed men, who kept an eye on who was sneaking where after dark. They weren't officially paid, but sometimes received favours, gossip, or leftover tithes. Their reports helped the church and the courts decide which whispers to investigate. You can imagine how well that system worked. Let's just say false accusations and petty revenge are as old as sin itself. You return to the courthouse the next morning and see the couple begin their penalty parade. Heads bowed, hands clasped, flower crowns wilting. One of the town musicians plays a solemn tune on a battered lute. It's not cruel exactly, but it is ridiculous. Children giggle. A few old men nod approvingly. "They'll remember this," someone mutters. And that's the debate, isn't it? Was the goal shame, deterrence, community control, or just pageantry dressed up as piety? Historians argue about it. Some say these punishments were genuinely believed to purge sin. Others say it was all performative, a moral spectacle to keep the church's authority visible without actual violence. Either way, the message was clear. It wasn't about what you did, it was about what you were seen doing. As the crowd disperses and the couple disappears down a side alley, probably toward another hayloft if we're honest, you're left standing under the market awning watching the drizzle return. Rules may have been strict, but enforcement? That was flexible, reactive, often theatrical, and if you could survive the embarrassment, life went on. You wander off, the sound of the lute still faint behind you, and wonder how many people in this village have done the same, or worse, and just never got caught. Probably most of them, probably even the ones watching. You're standing in the centre of a high-ceilinged stone hall, the walls hung with faded tapestries and the air thick with something between damp velvet and desperation. This is the great house of a noble family, a proper, land-owning, banner-waving coat of arms type. And today, it's hosting one of the more uncomfortable rituals of medieval aristocracy, the maidenhead verification. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. A young woman, barely 16, thin-lipped and pale as fresh linen, sits on a carved wooden chair while several older women hover nearby, whispering like vultures in silk. Her name is Isabeau, and she's about to be married to a man nearly twice her age, a baron who smells of hawk feathers and bad decisions. But before the wedding, there's business to settle. Isabeau's virginity, her supposed marker of value, is up for examination, literally. You stay back behind a lattice screen, because frankly, no one needs you any closer. One of the older women, a midwife with calloused fingers and a face like cracked parchment, steps forward. This is her job. She's not thrilled about it, but she knows the stakes. The family has arranged for her to inspect the girl and issue a statement. If Isabeau's deemed intact, the dowry remains as agreed. If not, all bets are off. Money might be withheld. The match could even be dissolved, all based on a membrane. And here's the kicker. Hymen inspection was wildly unreliable, even by medieval standards. They didn't have the medical knowledge to understand the body's variety, nor the awareness that the hymen could stretch, tear from things like riding or dancing, or be absent entirely. Still, the belief persisted that a virtuous girl should show physical proof. And so this medieval gendered nightmare played out in households across Europe, especially among nobles whose inheritances, titles and bloodlines demanded purity. Behind the screen, you catch the tail end of the midwife's examination. There's quiet murmuring, a basin of warm water, a faint sound of crying. Eventually the old woman rises and nods solemnly to the father. "She is fit for marriage," she says. Relief floods the room like sunlight. The father claps his hands. The mother sobs dramatically into her embroidered handkerchief. Isabeau, silent, pulls her shift back down and avoids everyone's eyes. You try not to scream, because this wasn't rare, not even close. The idea of a marketable maidenhead was embedded into medieval law, culture, and marriage contracts. Noble families treated virginity as a commodity, as tightly regulated and defended as the land they farmed or the coins they minted. In some places, proof of blood on the wedding sheets was expected the morning after the marriage. There were even ceremonial displays where the blood-stained linens were held up to guests like a banner of honour. No blood, bad sign, people whispered. Now for the fringe detail you probably didn't want but are absolutely going to get. Some brides faked it. Yes, there were recorded cases of women using chicken blood, crushed berries, or even pricking their fingers to stain the sheets and produce the required evidence. Some enlisted sympathetic maids. Others preemptively confessed to a minor accident to avoid scrutiny. In France, one enterprising woman stitched a tiny pouch of animal blood into her shift and crushed it at the right moment. Honestly, respect. Of course, the obsession with maidenhood didn't apply equally. Noblemen could, and often did, sleep around before marriage with little consequence. Sometimes with servants, sometimes with other nobles' wives, and occasionally with the local nuns. We'll get to that. But women? One slip, even just a rumour, could destroy their future. That's what made these inspections so high stakes. A bad report meant dishonour, poverty, even exile to a convent, or, in some unfortunate cases, death. You walk out into the courtyard and overhear two servants gossiping over a laundry basket. Lady Cecily bled so much they said she'd been torn by demons. The other snorts. She probably just fainted from fear. They both laugh, but you can hear the tension beneath it. They know that just because this girl passed the test doesn't mean they ever will. Servant girls, after all, weren't expected to stay chaste, but they were still punished when found out. The open scholarly debate around virginity verification is still ongoing. Some historians argue that these inspections were more symbolic than scientific, rarely thorough and often just ritual. Others insist they were taken very seriously, especially in politically sensitive matches. There are even medieval letters from fathers demanding third-party virginity experts be brought in to verify a potential bride before contracts were signed. That's right, independent maidenhead inspectors. Imagine putting that on your business card. And here's the sick irony. Despite all this obsession with purity, rape was rampant, and yet rarely punished unless the victim was of high status. If a peasant girl accused a nobleman of assault, she was more likely to be dismissed, shamed, or even punished herself. But if a noble bride was discovered to be impure, the man could annul the marriage, demand her dowry back, and send her packing. The system didn't care about consent, it cared about proof. Later that night, you find yourself near the servants' quarters, where laughter and music float through the air. A scullery maid dances barefoot with the stable boy, her hair loose, her smile free. For a moment, the oppressive weight of virginity as property disappears, replaced by something gentler. No inspections, no dowries, no hymen talk, just two people enjoying each other under the moonlight. You sit under a fig tree, watching the stars push through the sky, and think of Isabeau, of how her whole life has been arranged around the condition of her body, and how many girls like her have passed through this system, judged not for who they were, but for what was between their legs, and whether it had ever been touched. In the distance, bells toll softly for the evening prayer. Another day closed, another marriage sealed, another lie perhaps successfully performed. You stretch out your legs and whisper into the night, let her be happy, even if it's just in secret. Because in a world like this, secrecy was sometimes the only space where freedom could survive. You're in a dim library now, hidden deep inside a noblewoman's estate, stone walls, candlelight, and the faint perfume of ink, rosewater, and something slightly scandalous. The shelves are packed with thick leather-bound volumes, most of them poetry or saints' lives or histories of faraway kings, but it's the drawer beneath the writing desk that holds the real treasure. A pile of parchment letters, tied up with faded ribbon and smelling faintly of lavender and smoke. You untie the bundle with careful fingers. Unfolding the first one, the handwriting is elegant, but the content is not what you were expecting. Your hands haunt my dreams, the letter reads. I woke with your name on my lips and an ache in me that not even prayer could ease. You blink. This is not correspondence about crop yields or embroidery technique. This is long-distance lust, medieval style. And as you keep reading, the temperature in the room seems to rise. The author is a young noblewoman, anonymous, of course, and she's writing to her lover. Several lovers, actually, across the letters. Some are men, knights on campaign, clerics sent to Rome, local landowners with wives of their own. Others are women. Yes, other women. You find one letter addressed to a dearest sister in spirit, and after 3 lines, you're certain that's not a metaphor. The feel of your braid between my fingers lingers still. If you loved me as I loved you, say it in your reply. Send a violet wrapped in linen. You exhale slowly. These aren't just flirty notes. They're coded, carefully composed windows into a hidden world where feelings and bodies found each other, despite everything the law and church said. A world of stolen hours, pressed flowers, and, occasionally, scribbled desperation on borrowed parchment. In the broader culture, noble women were expected to be chaste, obedient, and decorative, living symbols of purity for their family's prestige. They were married off young, often to older men, and their lives were mostly confined to manors, chapels, and childbearing. But these letters crack that image open like a spoiled pomegranate. These women felt desire, acted on it, and most shocking, wrote it down, in ink, on paper, and saved it. You read on. One woman writes about a knight who removed her riding gloves for her as though undressing me for prayer. Another describes a moonlit encounter in the orchard. He kissed me beneath the quince tree, and I think God might forgive me, for I've never felt so close to heaven. Then a letter that simply reads, I dreamed of your mouth. No name, no signature. Just that. It's bold, spare, devastating. Now here's the fringe twist. Literacy among noble women in the medieval period was far more common than people think. They were educated, especially in noble households, often fluent in Latin and sometimes Greek, well read in Romance literature and religious texts and the like. And when women read stories about Tristan and Isolde or Lancelot and Guinevere, they didn't just study the morals, they felt something. Romance literature, especially the kind spreading in the 12th and 13th centuries, gave them a vocabulary for passion, for longing, for rebellion, and they used it. What you're holding, in fact, might be influenced by a literary tradition known as courtly love, a stylized form of romantic and often sexual devotion, originally meant to entertain but very much rooted in real emotional dynamics. In these tales, love was noble, forbidden, intense. It happened outside of marriage, and it was often initiated or equally pursued by women. You realise as you read one especially racy stanza that these women weren't just writing love letters, they were authoring their own stories, slipping out of the roles they'd been assigned. You find a letter that breaks your heart. It's a farewell from one woman to another, likely written just before one of them was married off. When next we meet, I will wear my new name like a mask, but in my dreams, I will still be yours. The part of me that he cannot touch belongs to you. You close the parchment and let that sit in your chest for a minute. So let's break it down. What happened when women strayed emotionally or physically from the sexual rules of the day? If caught, the consequences could be severe. A noblewoman having an affair with a man might be sent to a convent, disinherited, or worse, but with other women, the rules were murkier. Female same-sex intimacy wasn't always recognised as sexter by male-dominated courts or church leaders. In fact, some theologians argued that because it didn't involve penetration, it wasn't real sex, just misguided affection or harmless indulgence. That oversight gave some noblewomen room to move, to form deep physical bonds with each other that went unpunished, unspoken, or simply misunderstood. But make no mistake, it was real. These weren't pillow fights and innocent hugs. The passion in these letters pulses off the page, and not all of it stayed secret forever. There's a documented case of 2 French noblewomen in the 15th century who were accused of unnatural relations. The court transcripts describe immodest kissing and entanglement of limbs in a manner unbefitting Christian maidens. Sounds oddly poetic. One was exiled, the other married off to a distant cousin, the case quietly sealed. But the fact that the court even bothered suggests their relationship had grown visible enough to cause discomfort. And here's the scholarly debate. How widespread was all this? Were these letters rare exceptions or the tip of a parchment iceberg? Some argue that only a small elite ever had the education, privacy, and freedom to pursue forbidden love. Others believe these letters represent a broader, unseen culture of emotional resistance among women, using writing, poetry, and secret codes to carve out lives of their own in a system built to control them. You leave the library just as dawn breaks. The candles sputter. The house is quiet. In the fields beyond the manor, a farmer walks behind his plough, indifferent to the ghosts of passion folded into paper and tucked into drawers. But you carry them with you, these whispered confessions, these promises that bloomed in ink, even when they couldn't bloom in daylight. And maybe that's what made them powerful. Not that they broke the rules, but that they dared to dream past them. You look back once more at the manor's high windows and wonder how many women still write to someone they're not supposed to love. Probably more than anyone wants to admit. It's festival day in the village and the place is barely holding itself together. Chickens are running loose between wooden stalls, kids are flinging turnips at each other, and someone's definitely been drunk since sunrise. Bright cloth is strung up between trees and signposts, and the air smells like sweat, roast onions, and beer that has been sitting in the sun too long. Somewhere, a dog is howling in time with the fiddlers. You wander toward the centre of it all, drawn in like a moth to the chaos. This isn't a royal court, and no one here is quoting Latin or worrying about sin. This is peasant life, poor, loud, full of elbows and music, and on days like this, deeply and unapologetically physical. You see it in the way people dance, the way hands linger a little too long on waists, the way laughter slurs into flirtation. Today is not about rules, it's about release. And here's the fun fact for tonight. Peasants had their own rules about sex, and they looked nothing like the churches. Oh, they heard the sermons. They knew what they were supposed to do, abstain until marriage, avoid lust, don't lie with your spouse during fasting days, blah blah blah. But let's be honest. The local priest probably lived in a drafty shack and rarely bathed. He was more background noise than moral compass. In practice, village norms were flexible, local, and often based more on necessity than doctrine. Take the festival you're at now. It's the feast of St. Justina, apparently, though no one can tell you who she was or why she matters. What does matter is that today's a holiday. No work, no obligations, and for some, no inhibitions. You spot a drinking contest by the well, where the winner gets a goose and the attention of a girl with a crown of cornflowers. Nearby, a blindfolded game of tag has become suspiciously handsy. This is a mating ritual disguised as a church celebration, and everyone knows it. You find yourself pulled into a circle of dancers, the music loud and messy. A girl grabs your hand, she's missing 2 teeth but grins like a queen. "You're not local," she says, eyeing you. "You looking for a sweetheart or just a warm bear?" You stammer something and she cackles. "Don't worry, I won't tell the friar." In peasant culture, sexual behaviour was deeply intertwined with community expectations, but not in the way the church hoped. Virginity was valued, sure, but mostly because it improved a girl's marriage prospects, not because of some abstract concept of spiritual purity. And once 2 people were betrothed, that is, formally promised to each other, it wasn't unusual for them to start sleeping together. In some villages, it was even expected. If the woman became pregnant, it proved the match was fertile and could be sealed with a wedding. If not, the pair might quietly split, no harm done. This was practical, not rebellious. Marriage wasn't a romantic fairy tale, it was a survival pact. 2 families joining land, labour, or livestock. Love was optional, fertility was not. And so the rules adapted. The local customs filled in the gaps left by doctrine. For example, in some places, a couple could cohabit and be seen as married enough, as long as they were faithful and lived openly as partners, even if the church hadn't blessed it yet. These were called hand-fasting unions, and though legally murky, they were socially legitimate. Of course it could get messy. There were cases where couples separated after a pregnancy didn't occur, or when the relationship soured. The church tried to intervene in these situations, especially if accusations of fornication were thrown around, but often the villagers just handled it themselves, with gossip, social pressure, or in extreme cases, public shaming. Still, the enforcement was loose. After all, everyone had secrets. The local blacksmith had 5 kids and no known wife. The miller's niece looked suspiciously like him. And everyone pretended not to notice. The fringe moment comes when you overhear a mother coaching her daughter, maybe 17, on how to flirt. "Don't laugh too loud. Men like a quiet girl, but show your teeth when you smile. It makes them think you've still got all of them." The daughter rolls her eyes. "And if he grabs my backside?" The mother shrugs. "Grab back. If he runs, he's not worth chasing." They both laugh. There's something deeply earthy in their humour. A sense that sex isn't sacred or forbidden. It's part of life, like rain and mud and bad cider. Later you watch as a mock wedding takes place, part game, part ritual. A pair of teenagers are married by their friends using a flower wreath and a spoon as a ring. Everyone cheers, no one expects it to last past tomorrow. But there's joy in the pretense, and maybe that's the point. In this world you make your own fun, your own rules. Here's where the scholars get into it. Some argue that peasant sexuality was far more liberated than the upper classes, precisely because the church couldn't control it. Others say that's romanticising things, that women still faced shame and punishment, especially if a pregnancy occurred without a clear partner. The truth? Both views are valid. There was more freedom, yes, but also more risk. An unmarried pregnant woman could be rejected, forced into some servitude, or abandoned by her family. Yet it still happened, frequently. You walk toward the edge of the festival grounds, where a group of young couples have peeled off into the orchard. You hear giggling, the rustle of branches, a very suggestive squeak. No one seems particularly worried about what St. Justina would think. You lean on a tree and smile. The night is thick with the smell of apples and grass, and something far less innocent. This wasn't defiance, it wasn't rebellion, it was just life. In the mud, in the hay, under the tree, people loved, touched, risked, whispered and hoped. Not because they wanted to sin in, but because they wanted to feel. And when your days are filled with labour and cold winters and hunger, sometimes a warm body is the closest thing to salvation. The fiddlers start a slow tune. Somewhere a bonfire is crackling. You turn your face to the warmth and realise this is the kind of night that sermons can't touch. A night where real behaviour simply ignores the rules, like smoke slipping through fingers. It's well past midnight when you push open the side gate of the monastery. The hinges groan like they're trying to warn you. Inside, the world is cloaked in candlelight and silence. A faint smell of beeswax, old stone and damp linen lingers in the air. The corridors are narrow and echo with every step. You're not supposed to be here, obviously. This is a sacred place, a place of prayer, chastity and solemn devotion to God. And yet, you already know that's not the whole story. You pass through a low arch and into the cloister garden. Moonlight drips through the colonnade like spilled milk. A monk kneels beside a rosebush, muttering his prayers. Except, wait, He's not alone. There's a second figure, also robed, also quiet, but their hands are touching, just fingertips. Delicate, trembling. Their heads are bowed as if in reverence. But this is no prayer, it's longing in disguise. You step back into the shadows. You've seen enough to confirm what whispers have suggested for centuries. Celibacy was more aspiration than reality. From the outside, medieval monasteries and convents seemed like fortresses of purity. Walled off, sealed tight, dedicated entirely to God. And yes, there were monks and nuns who lived lives of true abstinence. But behind those thick stone walls, far from the village gossip and bishop's inspections, the truth was murkier. Some gave in to temptation, others never fought it to begin with. Let's get historical. The church required monks and nuns to take vows of celibacy, poverty and obedience, and to be fair, some genuinely believed in those ideals. But others? They saw monasteries as career moves. For noble families, sending a child to the church was a way to offload younger sons or inconvenient daughters. So imagine you're 16, sent away to a silent cloister with no say in the matter. Suddenly your whole world is Latin, fasting, chanting, and a whole lot of rules. Your body, however, doesn't care about rules. There are real records, many of them, describing sexual activity within monasteries and convents. Ranging from whispered kisses to full-on orgies. Yes, orgies. In one German abbey, the bishop's records complain of nuns dancing in the cloister, baring their arms, and receiving men through the garden wall at night. In another case, a monk was found hiding in a nun's cell during an unexpected inspection. His excuse? He was praying with her. You slip into the scriptorium, a room lined with desks and scrolls, and find a lone monk copying a psalter. He's young, flushed, and trying very hard not to look at the novice across the table. The tension is so thick you could chisel it. You glance at the margins of his manuscript. Tiny doodles, hearts, a woman's may, and what may or may not be a very bold attempt at anatomy. This isn't sin, this is horny calligraphy. Here's the quirky fringe detail for the night. Some monasteries were so scandalous they had reputations. Locals whispered about them. Some even had nicknames like the Abbey of Love or St. Mary's Pleasure House. In England, a 14th century abbot was excommunicated after it was discovered he kept a mistress in the monastery, had 2 children by her, and used church funds to build her a private chamber. And somehow he wasn't even the worst one. Not all of these relationships were heterosexual either. In cloisters where men lived with men and women with women, deep emotional bonds were inevitable and sometimes physical. Letters survive between monks expressing intense affection, often using the language of divine love to veil erotic undertones. Some scholars argue that same-sex intimacy flourished in cloisters precisely because it was ignored or misunderstood by external authorities. As long as no one made a scandal of it, the church preferred not to look too closely. You pass into the nuns' quarters through a hidden corridor, the smell of lavender and candle soot stronger here. A group of nuns sits in a circle, reading aloud from a text, not the Bible, but a medieval romance. One of them blushes as she reads a particularly steamy passage. The others giggle, then fall silent as a senior sister walks by. As soon as she's gone, the giggling resumes. A young novice leans over and whispers, "It's just a story, but Sister Marjorie dreams of knights more than Christ." She shrugs. Can you blame her? Of course, not every illicit relationship was consensual. There are dark corners here too. Powerful abbots abusing their authority. Nuns forced into silence. The cloister could be a refuge, but also a prison. When sex happened here, it wasn't always love. Sometimes it was survival. Sometimes it was just someone lonely reaching for the only warmth available. That's the scholarly debate right there. Were these relationships acts of rebellion, or simply human nature asserting itself? Some historians argue that sexual misconduct in monasteries was blown out of proportion by reformers looking to scandalize the church. Others believe we've underestimated how common it was, that the silence of archives reflects not absence but cover-up. The truth? Probably both. For every heartfelt poem between 2 nuns, there was a cover story written by a monk trying to dodge penance. You find a letter tucked into the pages of a prayer book. It's written in a woman's hand, delicate and rushed. "He kissed my fingers through the bars. I know it is sin. I feel no shame." That last line hits like a whispered revolution. Back outside, you pass the garden again. The monk and his companion are gone, but the air still feels charged. In the distance a bell rings. Matins. Time for prayer. Time to return to the performance of purity. But behind every psalm, every bowed head, you now see the shadow of desire, coiled and quiet like smoke under a door. The church built these walls to contain the flesh. But flesh, as it turns out, doesn't care about vows. It finds cracks, it slips through, it reaches for warmth in the dark and calls it love, or at least relief. As the first light of dawn creeps across the cloister's cold stones, you turn to leave. Behind you the bells toll and the monks chant in solemn unity. But you've seen what the silence hides, and it is far more human than holy. You wake up to the sound of fabric rustling, layers of it. Silk against wool, linen over skin, the soft whisper of hems sweeping across a stone floor. It takes a moment to orient yourself, but the moment you spot the gilded mirror propped against the wall and the rows of carved combs on the vandalier, you know, you're in a noblewoman's chamber, and today she's getting dressed. Not for war, not for a feast, but for the street, which in this world is its own kind of battlefield. A maid is helping her into her outer gown. The laces tighten like a corset of expectation. The sleeves alone could take down a small bird mid-flight, and the fabric costs more than a peasant's yearly wage. It's not modest, it's a statement. And you suddenly realise you're not watching someone get dressed, you're watching someone arm themselves, not just against the cold, but against judgment, temptation, and the ever-leering gaze of church and state. Because here's the thing, medieval clothing laws, called sumptuary laws, weren't just about vanity. They were about control, not just who could wear what, but who shouldn't, who got to look desirable, and who was punished for being seen that way. The church, of course, weighed in. As always, it preached that modesty in dress was a sign of inner virtue, that fine fabrics and bold colours stirred lust, and that a woman's appearance could tempt men into sin, and therefore it was partly her fault. The logic was as fragile as a moth-eaten tunic, but that didn't stop it from being enforced. You step out into the cobbled street, where the fashion show continues. A young merchant's wife walks by wearing green velvet, technically forbidden to anyone below Baroness rank in this region. A passing priest glares at her, muttering something about pride, but she doesn't flinch. She knows she's pushing the limits. That's the point. Sumptuary laws weren't just religious, they were political. Local governments used them to keep people in their place. Velvet, fur, embroidered silk, these were badges of class. If a tradesman's daughter started dressing like a duchess, it messed with the social order. The church claimed it was about morality. Everyone else knew it was about hierarchy. And then there's the fringe detail. In some towns, the church actually banned colourful undergarments for unmarried women because they were too suggestive. You hear that right. Undergarments. Things no one saw. But the idea was that knowing you were wearing something lacy and red was already corrupting. One bishop went so far as to claim that red stockings led to wantonness of the spirit. You're tempted to find a pair just to test the theory. Of course, the enforcement of these laws was wildly inconsistent. Rich merchants bribed officials to look the other way. Some tailors cleverly rebranded forbidden designs, like calling forbidden furs recycled pelts, or labelling silk as blended wool. It was a game of fashion hide and seek, with virtue on one side and style on the other. You make your way to the marketplace, where things get even more interesting. You pass a woman selling apples, her neckline low enough to qualify as an act of defiance. A young man stumbles mid-step while staring at her, nearly dropping his basket. She smirks, clearly used to the attention. But then an older woman nearby tuts loudly. "Harlot's collar," she says. "That's not a dress, that's an invitation." There it is. The ever-present double standard. If a man lusts, it's a struggle. If a woman is lusted after, it's a sin. The church insisted that modesty preserved dignity, but in practice modesty was weaponized against women, especially those who stepped even slightly out of line. A widow wearing bright blue, clearly seeking attention. A married woman who dared to wear her hair loose in public, definitely up to something. And don't even get started on perfume. You pass a perfumer's stall, ambergris, rosewater, the clove oil, and the vendor winks at you. For the married and the unrepentant, and he says. One tiny bottle claims to make a husband forget his prayers. Another is labelled Nun's Folly. Subtle. There's a record from 14th century Florence where a woman was arrested for wearing scented gloves and a gold-trimmed cloak, accused of trying to lure men away from their wives. She was fined heavily, but not for adultery. for fashion. Her husband, totally off the hook. That brings us to the open scholarly debate. Were sumptuary laws truly about moral reform, or were they just a way to police women's visibility? Some historians argue that they reflected genuine anxiety about lust and disorder. Others believe they were always a tool of patriarchal control, using dress codes to shame, discipline, and erase women who refused to play the part. Probably both. After all, nothing says piety like men telling women what's too sexy while wearing gold-threaded robes themselves. Later you find yourself inside a convent, watching a group of nuns sew. You'd think this would be a haven of modesty, and in many ways it is. Plain habits, covered hair, neutral tones, but even here you notice details. One nun has embroidered tiny stars into her sleeves. Another wears slippers with a hidden silk lining, small rebellions, little luxuries. Because even behind the walls of religious life, the human desire to adorn, to express, to feel beautiful never really disappears. You walk through the cloister garden as bells chime for evening prayer. A young novice passes you, her eyes rimmed with kohl, just a whisper of it. Just enough to say, I exist and I want to be seen. And maybe that's the real heart of the issue. It wasn't about the hemline or the fabric. It was about visibility, about who was allowed to take up space, and who had to apologise for doing so. As the sun sets, boom, you return to the noblewoman's chamber. She's undressing now, shedding the layers of expectation one by one. Her corset, her gown, her veil. She stands by the mirror in just a shift, breathing freely for the first time all day. She looks at her reflection, not with vanity, but with something more vulnerable. Like she's asking herself whether the day was worth it, whether the whispers, the stares, the judgment were the price for simply wanting to feel alive in her own skin. You leave her there, alone with the mirror, and step into the cool night. The wind catches your cloak. You feel the weight of the laws, the stares, the sermons. But beneath it all, you also feel resistance, stitched into sleeves, tucked into perfume bottles, and trailing behind every woman who dared to wear red in a world that insisted on grey. You're in the back corner of a smoky tavern now, the kind where the fire never quite catches and every ale barrel creaks like it's hiding ghost. A man with a milky eye is telling a story, and the entire room has gone still. Even the dog under the table has stopped chewing its bone. His voice drops low, like he's afraid the walls might be listening. A woman, he says, was found in the forest, lying with a beast. A gasp. Someone drops a cup. You lean in closer, waiting for the punchline, but it never comes. He's serious. Not a man, a creature, black-furred, cloven-hooved, eyes like coals. The locals around you nod like this is just Tuesday. Someone mutters, succubus, while another whispers, devil in a goat's shape. And just like that, you've stepped into the darker, foggier side of medieval sexuality, where fear and fantasy wrapped around each other like serpents, and accusations of beastly lust were taken very, very seriously. Let's be clear, bestiality was one of the gravest sexual sins in medieval law, like execution-level bad, not just a sin, but a violation of the natural order, the divine hierarchy. To lie with an animal, the church said, was to unmake yourself, become less than human. It was a direct slap in God's face. And yet the very specificity of the laws on this topic kind of gives the game away. You don't make that many rules unless people are actually doing it. The church and secular courts both punished bestiality harshly, but there's a strange twist. Sometimes the animals were punished too. Yes, in some documented cases, the goat, cow or dog involved was put on trial, publicly, with a judge, witnesses and everything. One poor donkey was found guilty of tempting a man and hanged. You try not to imagine the logistics of that and fail. Spectacle or not, it speaks volumes about the medieval belief that sin could infect everything it touched, even animals. But here's where things get really strange. Not all of these accusations were based on actual events. Some were political, some were used to ruin reputations, and some were the product of mass hysteria. Because in the medieval mind, sex wasn't just a private act, it had cosmic weight. And when things went wrong, when crops failed, babies died, or the sky stayed grey too long, people needed explanations. So they turned to the supernatural. They whispered stories of demons seducing women in their sleep, of witches lying with devils in the forest, of men waking up next to hoof prints on their sheets. You leave the tavern as the story ends and make your way to the edge of the village, where the woods begin. There's an old woman here, hunched over a basket of herbs. She looks at you without blinking. They say you dream of the goat man, she mutters. Comes in winter, warm breath, claws like hooks. You nod politely, not sure how to respond. She leans in. He doesn't come for everyone. Just the ones who sleep with longing in their hearts. And that's the fringe detail. Medieval people often believed that sexual dreams were not just dreams, they were visitations, that you could be seduced in your sleep, possessed, corrupted without your consent. And if you woke feeling, well, spent, it wasn't biology. It was a succubus, or an incubus depending on your anatomy. In some cases, people confessed to these dreams in detail, agonizing detail, during religious trials or in confessional booths. And the priest took them seriously. After all, if your body had responded, your soul must have consented. You might be punished for your unconscious lust. Some monks even wrote about their nightly battles with temptation, of dreams so vivid they feared they were being visited by Satan in disguise. You read one such confession once where the writer claimed the demon took the shape of a maiden with soft thighs and eyes that knew too much. Yikes. But here's the problem. Once you believe desire can be put there by an outside force, then anyone can be accused of harbouring unnatural lust. And that's exactly what happened. In certain cases, women, especially healers, midwives, or just women who didn't fit the mould, were accused of consorting with demons, of calling up beasts with their charms, of using magic to seduce men or animals, or worse. These weren't just superstitions, they had consequences. You flip through a set of trial records and find one from Burgundy, 1427. A woman named Estelle accused of laying with a wolf in the form of a man. No evidence, of course, just a rumour, a dream, and a neighbour with a grudge. She was tied to a post and drowned in the river. No trial, just a weight and water. The record ends with the words, "Her soul is in God's hands now." You doubt that was much comfort. Here's the scholarly debate. Was belief in demonic or bestial sex symbolic, an allegory for temptation, or literal? People really think someone could be seduced by the devil in animal form? Some historians argue these were all metaphors for spiritual corruption, misunderstood dreams, or even trauma. Others say no, these beliefs were real and deadly. That people genuinely feared a creature might crawl into their beds at night, whispering lies and lust in the dark. You walk back through the village past a shrine where someone's left a bundle of herbs, a coin, and a small carving of a goat. Offerings, apology, insurance, hard to say. But you do know this: the further you travel from cathedrals and courtrooms, the blurrier the lines get between sin and myth, between law and legend. Out here, in the places where the wind howls through trees and the wolves still sing, desire takes on a shape that looks very little like a lover, and a whole lot like a shadow. As the stars wheel overhead, you curl up near the fire in a small hut lent by a sceptical farmer. You think of the stories, the trials, the dreams, and for a moment you wonder how many of those midnight visitations were real, if not in flesh, then in feeling. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the devil in the woods, it's the fear inside your own skin. The sun is barely above the horizon when you arrive at the gates of a stone fortress that isn't quite a castle and isn't quite a prison. Though depending on who you ask, it's been both. Inside, the hallways are unusually quiet for a place this size. You walk beneath an arch carved with lions, step past a statue of Saint Sebastian, and enter a chamber where today's lesson is already underway. A scribe is lecturing to a small group of young boys in pale robes, all of them seated on hard wooden benches, back straight, eyes tired. You glance to the corner, and there, almost hidden in shadow, stands someone different. He doesn't sit with the others. He wears no sandals, his robe is too short, his voice when he speaks is high and soft. And when he rises to deliver his recitation, there's a subtle pause in the room, a flicker of discomfort so small you might miss it. You don't miss it, because this isn't just a student, this is a eunuch. Tonight you're stepping into one of the strangest and most uncomfortable intersections of medieval sexuality, the world of castration, ambiguous gender roles, and the way society tried, and often failed, to categorize the uncategorizable. In theory, the medieval world had strict boxes for people: men, women, clergy, laity, chaste, married. But in practice, there were always people who didn't fit neatly. Some were born with bodies that didn't conform to expected male or female anatomy. Others lost parts of themselves, by accident, through punishment, or deliberately. And then there were the eunuchs, men who'd been castrated, often young, often without choice and often for reasons that had nothing to do with piety. You follow the eunuch student down a corridor and into the small cloister garden, where he kneels to gather fallen leaves. His movements are precise, elegant even. You don't speak, just observe, because to ask a question here would be too direct and too dangerous. Historically, eunuchs occupied a peculiar space in medieval life. In parts of the Byzantine Empire, and later in Islamic courts, they were used as guards, advisors, and intermediaries. Their status was often tied to the assumption that they were safe, meaning they were believed to be incapable of sexual desire, or at the very least, sexual activity. This made them useful to kings who didn't want competition near their wives or concubines. And so the logic went, remove the risk, remove the parts, and gain a loyal servant. But in Western Europe, eunuchs were more rare and more controversial. They existed, yes, but uneasily. They appeared in religious life, sometimes hailed for their purity, but also eyed with suspicion. Because while the church praised celibacy, it condemned castration. Deliberate castration was considered a sin, even when done in the name of virtue. The line between holy and horrifying was razor thin. Take the story of Origen, a 3rd century theologian who supposedly castrated himself to avoid temptation. His devotion was praised, but the act itself condemned. The church officially banned the practice for priests not long after. Still, the image of the man without lust lingered, like incense in the collective imagination. Now here's the fringe fact for tonight. Some medieval legal texts actually included provisions for people who were neither clearly male nor female. The Latin term was hermaphroditus, and while the language was crude and the understanding limited, the law did attempt, awkwardly, to address the existence of intersex people. In one case, the court declared that such a person's gender should be judged by which nature appeared more dominant. That is, they were to be assigned either male or female depending on behaviour, appearance, and yes, seriously, who they preferred to have sex with. Subtle. It's in this legal grey zone that people like the eunuch you're watching had to live. Not entirely male by social standards, not female, not monks, not laymen, they were liminal. And because they didn't fit into a box, society often tried to erase them or mythologise them. You find a medical text in a scribe's study, its margins filled with strange illustrations. One diagram shows a person with both male and female organs. Another entry warns that those made barren by fire or iron may grow bitter of soul and turn to unnatural vices. You close the book, the fear is palpable. Not of violence or crime, but of bodies that defy neat explanations. That's the scholarly debate here. Were these individuals viewed with pity, respect, or horror? The answer, maddeningly, is yes, all of the above. Some were treated as holy anomalies, others as perverse mistakes. One record tells of a choir singer in France, described as high-voiced, smooth-faced, neither man nor woman, who became a minor celebrity, praised for his angelic tones and then accused of seducing young monks. His trial ended inconclusively, and he was quietly sent to a distant priory never heard from again. In a convent you find a different story. A nun writes in her diary about a visitor who wore a man's cloak but spoke in a woman's voice. She writes, "I knew not where to place them in my mind, but their eyes were kind, and I felt no fear. I prayed for them." That's it. No judgment, just confusion, softened by grace. You sit on a stone bench beneath a twisted olive tree and think about what it means to live between identities in a world obsessed with categories. How exhausting it must have been. How dangerous, and yet how persistent the human spirit is, even in the face of that erasure. The eunuch student passes you again, arms full of laundry now, his eyes catching yours just for a moment. There's something there, a flicker of recognition, not shame, not pride, just existence, a kind of quiet defiance, the kind that says, "I'm here, whether or not your rules account for me." The church said the body was sacred, but only if it followed the blueprint. Deviate, and you were either a miracle or a monster, maybe both, depending on who was in power that week. But the truth, written between the lines of trial records and the medical scrolls, is simpler. Some people didn't fit the mould, and instead of hiding, they lived in the spaces where rules cracked open. You leave the monastery as the sun begins to set, the stone walls glowing gold. Behind you, the bells chime for vespers, and the monks file into chapel in neat rows, except for one who moves more slowly, more thoughtfully. refusing to match the rhythm exactly. A body out of step. A life outside the law. And in that, somehow more honest than the rest. You're sitting on a crude wooden bench in the back of a small chilly courtroom, if you can even call it that. It's more like a converted storeroom behind the bishop's residence. The walls are stacked with sacks of barley, the floor is packed dirt, and the only official-looking thing in sight is a single crooked cross nailed to the wall. But the air is thick with tension, and the man standing in the centre isn't just here to argue about land or stolen goats. He's here because of a dream. His dream. Specifically, one that involved a woman, a demon, and a soaked blanket. The room smells of sweat and damp wool, but all you can smell is embarrassment. The accused, a young man no more than 20, is pale, shaking, and clearly regretting ever stepping into a confessional booth. "I swear," he stammers, "I didn't ask for it. It came upon me in the night. I woke and found evidence." Welcome to the wonderful, deeply weird world of medieval sexual sin trials, where the line between sleep, sin, and Satan was about as clear as mud. And yes, tonight's focus is exactly what it sounds like. Nocturnal emissions as criminal evidence, wet dreams on trial. The Inquisitor, a wiry priest with a voice like a wasp in a jar, leans forward. "And what was the nature of the dream?" he demands. The young man falters. "There was a woman, I think. Wings like a bat. She touched me. I couldn't move." A scribbler nearby raises an eyebrow and begins frantically recording every word. You glance over his shoulder. The entry reads, "Suspected incubus visitation. Subject claims paralysis and involuntary discharge." Well, that's certainly a sentence you never expected to read in your life. Here's the thing. In the medieval worldview, sex wasn't just a bodily function. It was a battleground. And dreams were just as real as waking life. If you experienced sexual pleasure in your sleep, the assumption wasn't always hormones. It was demons. More specifically, incubi and succubi, male and female demons who preyed on humans in their sleep, harvesting lust, stealing seed, or planting it. Depending on your plumbing, it sounds absurd now, but in the 13th to 15th centuries, these dreams were taken very seriously, especially when paired with physical evidence. Soiled sheets, mysterious scratches, strange bruises, or, most damning of all, pleasure that couldn't be explained. If you woke up with that sticky aftermath and no memory of how it happened, congratulations, you had just become a battlefield in the war between good and evil. And of course there's the fringe fact of the night. Some theologians debated whether demons could impregnate women this way, using stolen semen from other men, collected during their own nighttime visits. That's right. In this convoluted theory, demons were acting as supernatural sperm couriers. Thomas Aquinas, among others, weighed in on this with a straight face. The logic: men would ejaculate in dreams, demons would collect it, and then later deliver it to a woman, resulting in a baby with questionable origins. You sit with that for a moment, and suddenly everything you thought you knew about awkward dreams feels tame. But here's where things turn dark. The young man on trial today isn't being mocked, he's being judged. Because while some priests acknowledge that nocturnal emissions could happen naturally, especially in young men, others believe that these events only occurred when there was a willingness of the soul. Meaning if you had lustful thoughts, if you were impure in mind, the demons could find their way in. Not a full-on invitation perhaps, but a cracked window. You realise the weight of that idea. Imagine being 15, terrified of your own body, waking up one morning with physical proof that something happened in your sleep, and being told it was your fault, that you'd let Satan in, that your soul had given permission. You look at the boy again. He's trembling now, his voice barely a whisper as he pleads, "I didn't want it. I fight it every day." The court adjourns with a verdict of penance. 3 weeks of fasting, daily prayer at sunrise, and no sleeping alone. Which sounds like a punishment for a sin, but it's more like house arrest for your libido. The priest even recommends that the young man wear a hair shirt at night, a scratchy, uncomfortable garment meant to make sleeping so unpleasant that he won't get aroused. You can't help but think, no wonder so many monks developed insomnia. And here's the scholarly debate. How much of this was literal, and how much was metaphor? Some historians argue that the demonic dream stuff was just a symbolic way of talking about guilt and shame. Others point to the trial records and take them at face value. They really believed this, that dreams were portals, that desire could be proof of corruption, and that a soiled blanket could damn you to hell. Of course, there's another theory. one a little more grounded, that these trials weren't really about demons at all. They were about control. Sexual dreams are the one place the church couldn't reach. You can't confess a thought you don't remember. You can't police your sleep, but by creating a theology where even dreams could be sinful, the church managed to reach into the last truly private corner of a person's life. Your own unconscious mind wasn't yours anymore. It belonged to God, or to the devil. You were just a vessel. You exit the courtroom into the cool evening where villagers are lighting torches along the main road. You pass a mother with a crying toddler, a butcher sharpening his cleaver, a couple arguing in hushed voices about money, real problems, real fears, and then you think about the boy inside, terrified, shamed, made to believe his body betrayed him in the night. Back in the tavern, you overhear two men laughing over a drink. "I had a dream once about the baker's wife," one says. "She was riding me like a warhorse." His friend roars with laughter. "Better confess, or she'll show up for real and break your back." It's crass, yes, but also telling, because here, in the laughter, you find what the church was really afraid of, that people might learn to live with their desires instead of fearing them. You sip your drink and stare into the fire. In a world where even your dreams could be evidence, even your sleep a sin, the only safe place was silence. But some, you suspect, found ways to fight back with humour, with stubborn joy, or by dreaming anyway. You're in a cramped scriptorium again, hunched under the flickering glow of a tired candle, and the scroll in front of you smells faintly of mould, ink, and, oddly, apples. It's not scripture, not law, not a letter. It's a vita, a life story, one of those holy biographies that medieval scribes churned out by the dozen. This one is about a saint you've never heard of, Saint Elwine of Bragdon, and halfway down the page you stop cold. And lo, in the night her flesh did rise against her. The devil whispered through her bones. She tore at her habit and cried out for release, but held firm in prayer until her soul triumphed over her loins. You lean back, blinking. Okay, wow. That escalated fast. Tonight, you're diving into one of the more surreal genres of medieval storytelling. The holy but horny lives of saints who could not stop lusting, and how their very failure to be pure became part of what made them saints in the first place. It's a weird genre, honestly. You'd think sainthood would be reserved for people who are immune to desire altogether, those serene, untouchable types who floated 2 inches off the ground and never once looked at someone's ankles. But no, the medieval church loved a struggle. Saints who wanted to sin but didn't, those were the real MVPs, the ones who writhed in agony, suffered terrible dreams, confessed to yearning so intense it nearly killed them, and still held the line. Those were canonization gold. Take Saint Pelagia. In life she was a dancer, a courtesan, a woman whose wealth, charm and sensuality had half of Antioch crawling. The church called her a devil in perfume, and yet one day she repented, gave away her riches, and locked herself in a cell to pray. Not just a metaphorical cell, a literal one. She dressed in men's clothing, lived as a hermit, and died with her soul clean but scarred. The scar, of course, was her past and her body. You read another passage from Elwine's Vita. Even as she starved herself to weaken the desires of the flesh, the devil sent visions of naked men dancing in fountains of wine. She clawed at the stone walls and begged for blindness. You pause. Is this a saint's biography or erotic fanfic with a theological twist? The fringe fact here is that some of the most celebrated saints were basically celibacy thirst traps. Take St. Jerome, for example. In his letters, he writes about being tormented by dreams of dancing girls even as he read the Psalms. St. Benedict allegedly threw himself into a thorn bush to rid himself of desire. And then there's St. Catherine of Siena, who claimed that Jesus came to her in a vision and gave her an invisible wedding ring made from his foreskin. You stare at the page for a full 30 seconds after reading that one. Yeah, that happened. This wasn't fringe weirdness. These were major saints. Saints who saw their own bodies as enemies, who wrote about flesh like it was a battlefield they were stuck in. And for the church, that tension between overwhelming desire and total denial was the essence of holiness. Not the absence of lust, but the constant, tortured resistance to it. Holiness was measured in self-control, and suffering was proof of sincerity. But here's where the open scholarly debate kicks in. Were these stories meant to be cautionary tales? Spiritual metaphors? Or were they secretly erotic, a way for medieval readers to indulge in taboo fantasies under the guise of piety? Some scholars think these texts were functionally pornography for monks, safe because they ended in repentance, but titillating in the meantime. Others argue the writers were sincere, they genuinely saw the body as a trap, and every temptation as a test from God. There's also the gender divide to consider. When male saints felt lust, it was often portrayed as a noble trial. When female saints felt it, or, more often, provoked it in others, it became a story of danger and power. Saint Agnes, a teenage girl, was said to have driven men mad with desire, simply by being pure. In one version of her martyrdom, the soldier sent to violate her drops dead from lust the moment he sees her. That's one way to cancel a crime. You wander into the chapel after finishing the scroll. A statue of Elwine stands in a niche. She's depicted holding a rosary, eyes heavenward, barefoot, her tunic clinging to her form in a way that feels intentional. You wonder how many pilgrims gazed at that statue, felt a flush of something impure, and then dropped to their knees in penance. The cycle feeds itself. The hagiographies also did something else, something subtle but profound. They taught that even the holiest people were not immune to temptation, that even the virgins, the martyrs, the miracle workers wanted things. It made saints more relatable, but also kept everyone under suspicion. If they could fall, what chance did you have? Best to confess early and often. Later in the courtyard, you overhear two novices whispering. One says she had a dream about an angel with a voice like thunder and hands like silk. The other nudges her, laughing. Maybe it was the devil. Maybe you liked it. Their laughter fades into nervous silence, even in jest. They know the danger of desire in a world that demands self-erasure. You sit under the shade of a dying fig tree and think about how the church turned lust into performance. How every struggle became a story, every denial a badge of honour, and how some part of you, some human part, wants those saints to have given in just once, not because it would make them less holy, but because it would make them free. Because here's the truth the hagiographies tried so hard to suppress. The saints were human. Their bodies burned, their hearts raced, their thoughts strayed, and while they may have clawed at walls or worn chains under their robes, sometimes they also slipped, and sometimes, whisper it, they didn't regret it. The candle sputters out. A bell tolls for Compline. Somewhere another scribe dips his quill and begins yet another tale of a saint who moaned in torment beneath his robe and beat his chest until the devil fled, or until the ink ran out, or until he fell asleep, exhausted by the weight of a body he was never allowed to love. You walk into the night with those stories pressed into your skin like sweat. The stars are out, impassive, watching. You wonder which of them, if any, ever dreamed of saints who didn't need to suffer to be sacred. It's early morning and you're crouched in the back of a village kitchen that smells like burnt thyme and old cheese, pretending not to be in the way as a hunched woman crushes herbs with the kind of intensity normally reserved for battlefield surgery. Her sleeves are rolled to the elbows, her hands stained with berry juice and something darker. Maybe wine, maybe blood. On the table, bundles of sage, rosemary, dried rose petals, garlic cloves, fennel seeds, and one very suspicious-looking root shaped exactly like a limp finger. She's not cooking, not unless her soup makes people fall into each other's arms, moaning and tearing off their tunics. Welcome to the secretive, smoky and slightly sticky world of medieval love magic and lust potions, where kitchens doubled as laboratories and romance came in the form of tinctures, talismans, and occasional goat urine. The woman, who everyone in town just calls Aunt Bess, though she's clearly not anyone's actual aunt, adds a splash of something murky from a corked bottle and mutters a rhyme under her breath. You catch the word, tremble. That can't be a great sign. She glances at you, her one good eye narrowing. Don't sniff too close, she warns. This one's meant to drop a bishop to his knees. It's hard to know whether to laugh or run. Let's be clear. The use of love magic in the medieval world was widespread and deeply entangled with fear, desire, desperation, and a whole lot of improvisation. People wanted the same things they always have: affection, sex, loyalty, revenge. But when charm and poetry failed, or when societal rules said you couldn't even try, magic stepped in. These weren't just myths whispered on winter nights. Recipes for love potions were written down in grimoires and passed from hand to hand like sacred secrets. A common formula involved wine, cinnamon, a few herbs known for heating the blood, and, if the maker was particularly bold, menstrual blood or bodily hair. Some added animal parts, some used wax dolls, a few tried astrology. Everyone swore theirs worked, especially if you said the right prayer while stirring clockwise. Upika said Aunt Bess's next project. A small bag she's filling with herbs, flower petals, and what looks suspiciously like a lock of hair. Tuck this under his pillow, she explains to the red-faced girl standing across from her. If he dreams of you 3 nights in a row, he'll fall in love. If he dreams of his mother, start over. The girl nods solemnly and leaves. You stay because obviously you're not about to miss what comes next. Love charms weren't limited to women, of course. Men used them too, often more recklessly. You've read one record of a knight who tried to win a lady's affection by slipping a potion into her wine during a feast. She threw up in front of the bishop, passed out under the table, and woke up with no memory and still no interest. He was fined and publicly shamed, which seems fair, but his defence was telling. I only meant to make her favour me, not that. And that's the fringe detail tonight. Some medieval people genuinely believed that love magic could create not just desire, but obedience. That it could bend the will, that drinking a certain potion or carrying a certain talisman could erase someone's resistance. This wasn't always romantic, it was often about power. And when you combine desire with control, you get some very uncomfortable implications. That's why the church took a hard stance. Love magic, they said, was a gateway sin, leading to lust, fornication, adultery, and of course demonic influence. Using love magic was considered a form of sorcery, especially if it involved bodily fluids or invoked spirits. Penances ranged from fasting and excommunication to, in more extreme cases, burning. Yes, burning, because obviously setting someone on fire is the best way to address their romantic misunderstandings. But despite all that, the practice endured, because no sermon can compete with a broken heart. You read court records where widows are accused of using spells to lure new husbands, lonely farmers trying to seduce the midwife, teenage boys sneaking into the woods to bury love tokens under trees during the full moon. This wasn't rebellion, it was longing, the kind that pulses under the skin when logic fails. You find a parchment tucked into a basket under Bess's work table. It's written in scratchy Latin, half misspelled, but you make it out. A spell to ignite longing in the eyes of him who looks upon thee. Ingredients: fennel, wine, rosewater, a feather from a black hen, and the final line, Abika's name with lips wet from sleep. That's poetic. Creepy, but poetic. Here's where the scholarly debate sparks up like a bad tinderbox. Some argue that love magic was mostly symbolic, a placebo effect, that people believed it would work, so it did. Others argue that it was a form of agency for women, especially in a world where they were expected to be passive. Magic let them do something, claim something, even if it was risky, and risky it was. Some love magic was barely distinguishable from poison. A few recipes you find involve belladonna, which, fun fact, is toxic. Others call for mercury, or crushed beetles. The line between aphrodisiac and murder charge was, let's just say, flexible. But not all love magic was ingestible. Some was purely symbolic. You find a charm woven into the thread, 3 knots, each tied during a whispered prayer. The idea was simple: tie it around the target's wrist and they'd be bound to your affection. You imagine some poor farm boy waking up with a weird bracelet and a sudden urge to write poetry. Still, for every successful charm there were a dozen failures. Love isn't chemistry, it's chaos. You pass a man in the street swearing that his ex bewitched him. She made me follow her like a dog, he cries, even after she took up with the baker. No one believes him, but Bess nods knowingly. You stay late into the night, watching her pack tiny jars and bundles for the girls who come by in secret. One wants her husband to stop straying. One wants the girl next door to look at her differently. One just wants to stop dreaming about the stable hand. Bess gives them all something, some real, some not. Maybe that's the point, because magic, like desire, doesn't have to be logical. It just has to be possible, a whisper of hope, a vial of maybe. As you leave, the moon is high and the scent of rosewater lingers in the air. You wonder how many hearts will flutter tonight because of a bag of herbs tucked under a mattress or a potion slipped into a wine cup. How many touches will be bolder? How many glances longer? All because someone believed in a spell. And somewhere just out of sight, the church will scowl and call it sin. But down here in the kitchens and hedgerows, the people will keep stirring, tying, whispering, because love doesn't follow rules, and neither does magic. You arrive at the village square just in time to witness what looks, at first glance, like a parade. Music playing, people crowding in, even a juggler half-heartedly tossing apples near the market stall. But then you notice the figure in the middle of it all, a man, barefoot and red-faced, wearing nothing but a tattered shift and a crudely painted wooden sign hanging from his neck. The words on it are large and uneven. Fornicator. The crowd isn't cheering, they're laughing, pointing, whispering. A kid throws a cabbage. A woman snorts, that'll teach him. This isn't celebration, it's punishment. Welcome to public shame theatre, medieval style. The man stumbles as someone jeers, "Think your mistress will want you now?" Another voice calls out, "Next time, keep your hose on during Lent." The town's priest watches from the steps of the church, arm folded, lips tight, clearly approving. You can tell this is routine, not the man, perhaps, but the ritual, the performance. The idea that morality isn't just enforced, it's displayed, shamed, mocked into submission. You move closer to the makeshift stage, an overturned cart where two other offenders await their moment in the spotlight. One is a woman in her 50s with her hair unpinned and a smudge of ash on her forehead. The other is a teenage boy who looks like he might burst into tears or violence at any second. Both are wearing similar signs. Hers reads adulteress. His, masturbator. You weren't expecting that one, but apparently the village scribe caught the boy behind the stables with his tunic suspiciously bunched. And now here he is, on a cart, cheeks burning, while the butcher's wife hurls puns about pounding grain at him. You think of stocks, pillories, cages, common medieval punishments. But this is something different. This is ritualized humiliation, not just for punishment, but for entertainment. These aren't executions. They're morality plays with real bodies and real consequences. Here's the historical nugget to chew on. The medieval church actively encouraged public penance for sexual sins. It wasn't enough to confess in private. If your transgression was public, your penance had to be too. And that usually meant theatrical humiliation, walks through town in sackcloth, kneeling outside churches, even crawling on your knees through the streets during major festivals. Nothing says, "I'm sorry I touched a widow under the altar table," like bleeding palms and horse dung in your hair, but the real fringe detail. Some towns had official sin parade days, especially during Lent or Advent. Imagine a scheduled day where sinners were marched through the streets with signs, costumes, and sermons shouted from carts. And no, this wasn't limited to commoners. Wealthy citizens could be shamed too, though they often paid to reduce the spectacle. One noblewoman was famously allowed to do her penance indoors, surrounded only by close family and a single very polite monk. Back in the square, the woman marked adulteress stands with her hands folded, staring straight ahead. She's not weeping, she's not defiant, she's just there, holding herself up like a fence post in a storm. Someone throws a turnip. It hits the ground beside Hader, and the crowd roars with laughter. You feel something twist in your stomach. The open scholarly debate here is fierce. Some historians argue that public shaming was an effective moral deterrent, that it kept people in line in a world without prisons or surveillance cameras. Others argue that it was about power, especially the power to control sexuality. When sins like greed or gluttony were rarely punished in public, why was sex so performatively condemned? Because sex is visible, or at least the consequences are. A pregnancy, a rumour, a slip of the hand during Mass. And in a culture where sin equalled social failure, public shame wasn't just about repentance. It was a warning. Don't be like this person. Don't want what they wanted. You follow the parade as it winds toward the church. The bell tolls as the priest begins his sermon. "These are the souls who strayed from God," he says, gesturing to the sinners like a ringmaster introducing his act. "Let their suffering cleanse them and remind us to resist temptation." The crowd listens, sort of, you see. Mostly they whisper, point, remember that one time someone else got caught, laugh at the irony of who didn't. You glance across the square and catch sight of a nobleman's son smirking behind a tankard of ale, his arm draped around a woman who by all accounts is not his wife. No sign on him, just smirks and immunity. That's the hypocrisy baked into this system. public shame wasn't applied evenly. If you were poor or female, or otherwise disposable, your sins got paraded. If you were rich, connected, or discreet, you got forgiven behind closed doors. Maybe a donation, maybe a vow of silence, maybe nothing at all. Later, after the crowd disperses and the square returns to its usual muddy rhythm, you find the boy with the "Masturbator" sign sitting behind the chapel, shaking, trying to scrub the ink off the board. He doesn't look dangerous. He looks humiliated. You want to say something, but what's there to say? You've just seen how medieval justice works, not as a cure, but as a spectacle. You walk past a cart loaded with turnip, one of which still bears the splatter from the earlier performance. A pig sniffs it and squeals. Somewhere nearby, a group of girls are already repeating the chant that was hurled at the woman in sackcloth. It'll be part of village gossip for weeks, maybe years. The shame sticks longer than any punishment. As you leave the square, you wonder how many of the people watching were guilty of the same things. Probably most, probably all, but guilt alone isn't enough. You have to get caught. And once you do, the village gets a new play, a new cast, a fresh moral to chew on while the bread bakes. And maybe that's the worst part. Not the punishment. Not even the shame, but the way it becomes entertainment. A story people tell each other to feel clean, while secretly, they all hope they're never the one in the centre of the stage. You wake up to the sound of distant shouting. Not angry, just loud, chaotic, and oddly cheerful. Outside your tent, a smoky dawn creeps over a field littered with drying laundry, empty wine jugs, a couple of discarded boots, and one soldier fast asleep with a chicken under his arm. Welcome to a Crusader encampment somewhere near the eastern frontier, 12th century-ish, depending on which timeline is bothering to be accurate. The banners are flapping, the horses are snorting, and from the look of it, nobody here is even remotely interested in chastity. Because here's the reality. Medieval Crusader camps were not monasteries on wheels. They were messy, crowded, tense, half-starved little cities on the move, packed with every kind of person you'd find in a medieval town, just with more swords and worse hygiene. And when you throw thousands of armed men into a foreign land for years at a time, under the thin banner of religious zeal, with no wives in sight, well, things happen. You step over a muddy trench and make your way toward the main encampment. Passing tents that are already vibrating with morning activity, a group of knights are laughing loudly, one of them chasing another with a leg of roasted meat. A washerwoman leans over a basin, her dress hitched up, arguing with a cook about whether the bishop's wine stores have been raided, again. A boy no older than 13 runs past with a wooden sword and a grin, shouting something about devils in the next valley. And then you spot her, tall, sunburnt, wearing a veil that slipped down enough to reveal her gold hoop earrings. She's carrying a bucket in one hand and an unmistakably flirtatious expression. The knight whistles. She rolls her eyes and keeps walking. She's not a nun. She's not even a camp follower in the formal sense. She's just here, like dozens of other women who've attached themselves to the Crusader train for protection, for profit, or because they had nowhere else to go. That's the first myth to break down, the ideas that Crusaders were all celibate holy warriors. They weren't. Some took vows of chastity, sure, temporarily. Many didn't. There were married knights who brought their wives, unmarried ones who took up with local women, soldiers who paid for pleasure, bartered for it, or took it by force. The church preached purity, but the road to Jerusalem was long, and desire doesn't pack neatly into a saddlebag. You walk past a tent that's swaying. 2 pairs of boots are outside. You do the math. A nearby priest mutters, "Sinful," then shrugs and walks the other way. There's penance later, after all. And speaking of penance, here's the fringe fact of the day. Some Crusaders brought their own confessors just so they could sin and be absolved in real time. Like spiritual Uber Eats. One chronicler even recorded a knight who had sex with a camp follower and confessed before sunset, just in case he died in battle the next morning. Efficient. The church, for its part, tried to keep up appearances. Popes issued official decrees warning Crusaders not to consort with prostitutes, especially in the Holy Land. There were efforts to segregate men and women, to cleanse the camps before battles. But the reality, those orders were about as effective as a lace curtain in a thunderstorm. The camp swelled with life. Cooks, laundresses, blacksmiths, merchants, thieves, dancers, hangers-on of every moral stripe. One report from the Second Crusade described a scandal involving 2 monks who were caught in extremely compromising positions with a married washerwoman. They were punished. Yes, but only after the battle was won. Priorities, apparently. That brings us to the open scholarly debate. Was the church complicit in all this, or simply overwhelmed? Some historians argue the popes turned the blind eye, recognising that trying to control the sexual behaviour of thousands of armed, half-drunk men was a fool's errand. Others suggest that military necessity trumped morality. Better to have a relaxed rulebook than a mutiny. After all, you can't fight the infidel if you're sulking over denied pleasures. You stop at a fire pit where a few men are sharing stories, passing around something that might be wine or vinegar, depending on the bottle's mood. One man swears he bedded a Saracen noblewoman who mistook him for a prince. Another brags about a brothel outside Antioch that offered discounts for men with holy relics. Everyone laughs. No one seems remotely ashamed. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Sexual violence was rampant, especially during sieges. When a city fell, soldiers were rewarded with looting rights, which often included women. Chronicles from the time record brutalities that are hard to read, let alone romanticize. But while those acts were often condemned in writing, they were rarely punished in reality. Lust, like rage, was seen as part of war. Unfortunate maybe, inevitable, definitely. You move to the edge of camp where a group of women are gathered around a pot making a thin stew. One of them speaks quietly about her journey, how her husband died en route, how she bartered herself for safe passage through hostile territory. Her voice is flat, not ashamed, not proud, just real. This wasn't a story of sin, it was survival. Later that night, music rises. Someone's playing a lute. There's singing, more drinking, and shadows slipping between tents, soft giggles under the stars. You realise you've landed in one of those blurry corners of history where law, morality and behaviour are completely out of sync. The church was still the official voice. It still condemned fornication, adultery and lust. But in this travelling, transient world where death was never far and pleasure was often the only distraction, rules became background noise. One night passes you, drunk and giddy, his arm around a girl who looks half amused, half annoyed. He lifts a flask and slurs, "God forgives I." You don't answer, because in this moment, with laughter behind you and firelight flickering against canvas, you know exactly what kind of forgiveness he's banking on. As the camp settles into uneasy sleep, you lie beneath your borrowed cloak, listening to the hush of bodies shifting in the dark. You think about all the sermons left unread, all the vows conveniently postponed, all the sins waiting to be confessed. If not tomorrow, then maybe someday. After Jerusalem, after Victory, after everything. Because out here, under a sky too big to be holy, desire doesn't wait for permission. It just happens. You arrive at a crumbling stone priory just after Vespers, and everything's quiet except the soft rustle of robes and the occasional creak of aging wood. The building itself is weathered, more moss than mortar in places, but it stands tall in that way only medieval architecture can, as if daring time to knock it down. You slip inside under cover of dusk, through the side door where the novices sometimes sneak out for air or secrets. Tonight, it's secrets you're here for. Specifically, the kind not written in any official history. The kind you have to feel in the pause between glances. The kind that was whispered and never spoken aloud. Because within these cloistered walls, far from the eyes of parish priests and judgmental bishops, existed a truth that rarely made it into sermons. Same-sex intimacy did happen. Quietly, cautiously, and more often than anyone wanted to admit. You make your way through the hallway, past doors with tiny crosses carved into their lintels, and pause outside a chamber lit by a single candle. Through the thin wooden slats, you can hear voices, 2 monks, close in age, close in breath. One reads softly from a psalter, the Latin slipping out slow and smooth. The other murmurs something inaudible and laughs, and then silence. Not the awkward kind, the intimate kind, the kind that presses its palm over your mouth and dares you to move. This isn't scandal, it isn't perversion. It's just quiet longing in a world that demands silence. Historically, the church condemned sodomy broadly. So broadly, in fact, that the term covered everything from non-procreative sex between married people to mutual masturbation to same-sex acts between men or women. But the actual enforcement? That was inconsistent, often deeply class-based, and shrouded in discretion, especially within the closed environments of monasteries and convents, where individuals lived, prayed, and slept in close quarters for decades. You find your way to the cloister garden. where a young monk is tending a patch of herbs in the fading light. He doesn't see you at first. He's humming. His hands move over the rosemary with such gentle familiarity that it takes a moment to realise he's not alone. Another monk stands close, too close for anything but understanding. They aren't touching, but their proximity is electric. You feel like an intruder. You are. But you're also witnessing something rarely spoken of in the official chronicles, the human reality behind the holy image. Because for all the rules, same-sex intimacy existed in the medieval world, and not just as scandal. Sometimes it was love. Sometimes it was lust. Sometimes it was companionship in a life built around denial. Now here's the fringe historical fact. Some monastic communities developed what we might now call romantic friendships, deeply emotional, often physically affectionate bonds between same-sex pairs. These were documented in letters, in shared graves, even in spiritual testaments. Some abbots referred to their companions as beloved of my soul. One monk called his friend my mirror, my breath, my constant light. These weren't necessarily sexual, but some were, and in truth the line was blurry. Convents too held similar stories. You find a journal left behind by a 14th century nun named Agnes. In it she writes about another sister, Marjorie, with phrases that crackle off the page. Her mouth tasted of honey. We shared our prayers and our dreams. I think I sinned when I wanted her more than I wanted heaven. There's no further entry after that one. The page is stained and half torn. Whether by accident or intent, you'll never know. Of course, when these relationships were discovered, or suspected, they could be devastating. Punishments ranged from silent transfer to public shame to full ecclesiastical trials. There's a surviving Inquisition record from 1471 involving 2 Italian monks accused of lying together nightly and corrupting each other's purity. Their punishment was exile and enforced solitude. And yet the record also contains their defence. We loved as brothers do, and no evil passed between us. Whether that was true or just damage control, the plea is heartbreaking in its simplicity. The open scholarly debate circles around one key question. How widespread was same-sex intimacy in cloistered life? And to what degree was it understood as sinful versus natural? Some historians argue that deep same-sex emotional bonds were normalised in monastic environments, even celebrated, until someone crossed a visible line. Others suggest the Church knew full well that these bonds went further, and simply turned a blind eye when it served stability. Because expelling too many monks or nuns at once would create more scandal than letting a few secrets simmer quietly. You step into the priory's tiny scriptorium and scan the shelves. Tucked between saints' lives and copies of Aristotle, you find a worn volume of Song of Songs, annotated in the margin by an unknown hand. He kisses me with the kiss of his mouth, this I know not from God, but from another. You stare at the words, their intimacy, their bravery. You wonder who wrote them. You wonder if they were ever found out. You hope not, because sometimes, in the dark behind high stone walls and the hum of chanting, people found each other, not to sin, not to corrupt, just to exist, to feel warmth in a world that often demanded emotional frost. Maybe it was a touch, maybe it was a letter slipped under a door, maybe it was just a glance held a little too long across a chapel bench. As you leave the priory, the sky is deepening into indigo. A bell tolls in the distance. Somewhere inside, prayers are being whispered, and maybe, just maybe, so are the names of those who could never be spoken aloud in daylight. You wonder how many are still buried side by side, their secrets etched only in the gaps between lines. You cross the field, looking back once, and you swear you see 2 figures in the window above the cloister, standing close in the flicker of a single candle. Not ashamed, not afraid, just real. The ink is still drying when you find it, tucked between 2 crumbling hymnals in a convent library that hasn't seen a broom or a bishop in at least a decade. It's not an official manuscript, and definitely not part of the church-sanctioned reading list. It's bound in faded leather, the kind you open slowly, as if afraid it might sigh. Inside, margins bursting with sass, sarcasm, and something that looks suspiciously like a doodle of a nun slapping a priest. You've just found what's been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Nuns who wrote, joked, teased, and sometimes flirted from behind their ink-stained veils. Women who took chastity vows and then quietly, irreverently scribbled all over them. Tonight, you're flipping through the voices that were supposed to be silent. The convent is quiet at this hour. Outside, the sheep are finally settled, and Sister Hilda is snoring gently in the adjacent cell. But here, under the flickering light of a stubby beeswax candle, you're digging into the scribbled legacy of women who refuse to be erased. The margin notes aren't theological commentary, they're spicy, playful, wry. One says, in Latin, "If Brother Matthew had thighs like this, I might believe in temptation." Another, more poetic, "My heart longs not for heaven, but for warmth under the winter blanket." There's even a drawing of two doves kissing. You're not entirely sure they're doves. This is the secret life of the cloistered woman, not the one painted in stained glass or recorded in dry letters to the bishop, but the internal world that pulsed beneath the linen and silence. And no one captured that world better than the women who took up the pen when no one was looking. Medieval convents were supposed to be places of seclusion, chastity and prayer, but they were also schools, libraries, artistic hubs. Places where women, especially those from noble families, were taught to read, write, paint and think. And with access to ink, parchment and long hours of solitude, many did what human beings always do when given a blank page. They told the truth, or at least their truth, sometimes under pseudonyms, sometimes not, sometimes hidden in the back of a hymn book, sometimes sent to other convents in secret, like letters from another planet. And here's the fringe fact for tonight. A number of surviving medieval texts written by nuns include not just theological musings, but full-on erotic metaphors. The most famous is probably Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess who wrote about the moistness of divine love and visions that honestly read more like sapphic fever dreams than saintly revelations. Her language is soaked, pun intended, with sensuality, and she wasn't alone. One lesser-known text you stumble upon is a poem titled "For My Sister in Linen," written in the late 14th century by an anonymous nun in the Rhineland. It reads like a love letter, and not a platonic one. "Your voice is like warm wine," she writes. "When you laugh, I forget my prayers." You read it again, and you realise this wasn't rebellion. This was longing with nowhere to go. There's an open, scholarly debate here, and it's a heated one. Were these writings expressions of literal eroticism, spiritual metaphor, or something in between? Some historians argue that the language of medieval mysticism, kisses, embraces, bodily longing, was symbolic, never meant to be read as physical desire. Others point to the intimate tone, the anatomical detail, the emotional weight, and say, no, these women knew exactly what they were feeling. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Being locked away from the world didn't prevent desire. If anything, it amplified it. Convents were pressure cookers filled with intelligent, emotional women told to forget their bodies while living shoulder to shoulder in tight quarters. The church told them to suppress, to sublimate, to sacrifice. But the pen gave them a release, quiet, untraceable, holy in form maybe, but human in every line. You turn another page and find a list of saints not to trust. It includes St. Jerome, too grumpy, St. Augustine, talk too much about lust, and, most hilariously, St. Francis, might steal your lunch. You grin. Someone had a sense of humour. In fact, the more you read, the more you see it. Sarcasm woven through piety, wit hidden beneath the psalms. A marginal note next to a dry sermon reads, "If Father Anselm preaches one more hour, I'll commit a real sin." You picture a group of young nuns gathered in secret, passing notes, composing verses, laughing into their sleeves. Not rebels, exactly, not heretics, just alive. And in a system that tried so hard to flatten them into obedient silence, that's its own kind of revolution. But it wasn't without risk. You find a record in a separate text, this one from a disciplinary register. A nun caught with improper writings was sent to solitary confinement for 40 days. Another was stripped of writing privileges entirely. A third, too clever, too loud, was transferred to a more remote convent, where she was forbidden from speaking during daylight hours, not for what she did, but for what she wrote. Still the words survived, because words always do. You flip to the final page of the little book and find, scrawled at the very bottom in faded ink, "They will not remember my face, but perhaps they will remember my voice." You swallow. It's not a prayer. It's a promise. Outside, the chapel bells ring midnight. You slip out of the library, the weight of their voices heavy in your satchel, their ink drying again in your memory. You pass a young novice kneeling in the hall, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. You wonder what she's really thinking, whether her thoughts are holy or honest or both. Because here in the convent, chastity is the rule, but language is the loophole. You can't touch, but you can write. And in those margins, in those poems and jokes and whispered longing verses, women carved out tiny sanctuaries where they could be real, where they could laugh, where they could want. And centuries later, you're still reading them. You find yourself standing on the edge of a sunlit courtyard, watching a girl, maybe 12, maybe not even that, twirl in a dress far too elaborate for someone her age. The cloth is stiff with embroidery, gold threads catching the light as she spins, arms outstretched like a child at play. But she's not playing. She's rehearsing. For her wedding. The older woman beside her, maybe an aunt or nurse, claps softly and says, "Now curtsy again. Lower. He's a baron, remember?" The girl nods and obeys, eyes down, mouth pressed into a determined line. No giggles, no joy. This is serious business. After all, she's getting married tomorrow. And no one seems especially alarmed by that. Welcome to the world of medieval child marriage, where legality, politics and property danced far ahead of biology or consent. The practice was common, especially among nobility. Marriage at its core was a contract, a way to bind families, secure land, forge alliances. Love, optional. Puberty, also optional. The church technically required girls to be at least 12 and boys 14 to wed, but that was only the minimum. There were exceptions, there were loopholes, and there were many, many marriages arranged well before the bride had ever thought about menstruation. You duck into the stone chapel where the priest is preparing for the ceremony. He's tired, adjusting the folds of his vestments, muttering the vows under his breath. You glance at the register. The groom is 28. His bride is officially listed as 12 winters, which is medieval shorthand for absolutely not okay by modern standards. But here's where things get murkier. Marriage wasn't always immediately consummated. In theory, the groom was supposed to wait until the bride was of age, a vague phrase that could mean biological puberty or, more conveniently, whenever her husband or guardian decided she was ready. Some did wait. Some didn't. Enforcement was nearly non-existent. And when consummation did happen, it was legally binding. No backing out, no annulments. Because intercourse, not ceremony, was what truly sealed a medieval marriage. That meant even if a girl married at 9, the real legal alarm bells only rang once the sheets were stained. Here's the historical detail that lingers like smoke. Some noble girls were married as early as age 7. Not always to be bedded immediately, but to be possessed legally, socially, and economically. Their value was measured in dowry, bloodline, and obedience. A successful match wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a strategic move, a chess piece snapping into place. The fringe fact? In some cases, consummation before puberty wasn't considered valid. But that didn't stop it. There's a particularly unsettling case from 14th century England, where a lord insisted his 10-year-old wife be examined by a panel of midwives to confirm whether she was ripe. She was not. He waited 2 years, then tried again. You walk into the manor hall where the wedding feast is being prepared, long tables stacked with meats, honey cakes and spiced wine. The musicians tune their instruments. The bride's family chats casually with the groom's retainers. There's no scandal here, no murmured concern, just celebration. Because this isn't seen as a moral issue, it's just how things are done. And that's the open scholarly debate. How much did these young girls understand about what was happening to them? Some argue that noble girls were raised from birth to expect marriage as duty, drilled in etiquette, prayer, and how to look pleasing at a banquet. Others point out that surviving letters and diaries show real fear, confusion, loneliness, trauma. And the commoners? Their stories rarely survive, but we know it happened there too. Sometimes for economic reasons, sometimes to settle debts, sometimes just because life was short and everyone married early. You sneak a glance at the bride again. She's seated now, ankles swinging above the floor, chewing a strand of her veil. She looks tired, or bored, or maybe just overwhelmed. A serving girl offers her a cup of watered wine. She sips, stares off into the middle distance like a soldier before a long campaign. What's left unsaid in these stories is the emotional cost, the identity wiped clean. Because once a girl was married, child or not, she became a wife. Her status changed. Her legal autonomy, if she ever had any, disappeared. Her job was now to bear children, serve her husband's household and behave with decorum, even if she still played with dolls under the bed. You find a letter in the archives later, written by a 13-year-old girl to her mother. The Latin is messy. The sentiment is not. I do not like his beard. He is kind but too large. I cry each night, but tell no one. They say I must have a son soon or be sent away. The rest of the letter is smudged. Maybe she dropped a tear on the page. Maybe the ink just ran. Either way, the story ends in silence. The church, for all its rules, was disturbingly flexible on this issue. Popes granted dispensations, bishops blessed unions, as long as the property changed hands correctly, and the couple mumbled their vows in front of witnesses. It was considered lawful. There were exceptions, rare saints who objected to forced marriage, court cases where girls successfully resisted, but they were outliers. Footnotes: the system favoured conformity. The younger the better, easier to mould, easier to claim. As evening falls, the wedding begins. You watch from the back of the chapel as the girl steps forward, led by two older women. Her hands are trembling. The groom smiles awkwardly, placing a ring on her finger. It slides loose. Her fingers are still child-sized. The priest drones the vows. She repeats them, voice flat. It's over in minutes. Applause, wine, coins thrown in the air. A new alliance forged. You don't stay for the bedding ceremony. Some places skipped it, others didn't. In many noble households, the couple was put to bed in front of witnesses, sometimes with prayers, sometimes with jokes, sometimes with heavy silence. It was symbolic, yes, but also sometimes painfully real. As you walk into the night, the stars look no different. The village is quiet. But somewhere inside that stone manor, a girl in gold embroidery is lying still in a bed too large for her. And whether her husband touches her tonight or not, the world has already decided who she is. Wife, child, pawn you don't know her name. Neither will history. You're in a candlelit chapel again, but this one feels different. The air is thick, not with incense or reverence, but with something else, something heavier. A chill wraps around your ankles, and the only sound is the slow drip of wax down the tall altar candles. Above the nave hangs a painting, aged, cracked, but still vivid. A young woman, eyes turned upward, arms bound, her bare feet dangling just above the ground. She's smiling, or at least she's supposed to be, but her face looks strange, like someone trying very hard not to scream. Tonight, you're sinking into the murky, uncomfortable space where purity, pain, and erotic storytelling collided, the cult of the Virgin Martyr. And it's about to get extremely weird. Let's start with what you're looking at. This is Saint Agatha. According to tradition, she was a teenage girl from Sicily, martyred in the 3rd century for refusing to marry a pagan governor. When he persisted, she resisted, so naturally her punishment involved having her breasts torn off with iron hooks. Then, to make things even more holy, apparently, she was thrown in a dungeon where, miraculously, St. Peter showed up to heal her. She eventually died from her wounds, still proclaiming her virginity. In the painting before you, she's holding her own severed breasts on a platter like they're dinner rolls. And the weirdest part, this became popular devotional material. People venerated her, prayed to her, and commissioned paintings of her, holding what had been violently removed, all in the name of chastity. You step further into the chapel past other paintings. St. Barbara, locked in a tower by her father, refusing marriage and dying for it. St. Agnes, stripped naked and thrown into a brothel, only to be shielded by her hair, or angels, depending on the version. St. Cecilia, beheaded slowly while singing praises to God. These women were paragons of virtue. They were holy, and yet the stories weaved around them were saturated with bodily detail, intense suffering, and a kind of almost fetishistic obsession with purity at any cost. Torture and virginity became entwined. The more brutally a woman resisted sex, the more sacred she became, and medieval audiences couldn't get enough. That's not metaphor. Manuscripts of these saints' lives circulated widely. Their feast days were celebrated with full processions. Pilgrims visited their shrines hoping for miracles, especially women who wanted protection from sexual assault or infertility. But also, people just loved these stories. The danger. The drama. The almost unbearable tension of a girl holding onto her virginity while the world tried to tear it from her, literally. Here's your fringe fact for the night. Some of these hagiographies describe the pain of martyrdom in disturbingly erotic terms. One text about St. Lucy describes her eyes being torn out, followed by a passage noting her ecstatic moan as she thanked Christ for making her undesirable to men. Others linger on the binding of wrists, the softness of skin, the exposed bodies of virgins stripped before execution. You don't have to squint too hard to see what's going on. And here comes the scholarly debate that refuses to die. Were these stories spiritual metaphors gone too far, or were they medieval erotic thrillers dressed in holy robes? Some argue that the violence was symbolic, the tearing of flesh representing the soul's triumph over temptation. Others point out the sheer volume of detail in these texts and ask, are we sure this wasn't written for the monks with the other kind of knightly struggle? The deeper you go, the more twisted it gets. Because these virgin martyrs weren't just resisting sex, they were resisting power. Patriarchal, political, often imperial power. And in resisting, they became dangerous. Think about it. A teenage girl saying no to a governor. A king, a pagan god, refusing to submit even when threatened with death. That's revolutionary. That's terrifying. And, in the logic of the time, the only way to contain that rebellion was through torture and sanctification. If she dies resisting, she's no longer a threat. She becomes an icon. You read a passage from the Passion of St. Margaret of Antioch, and it's pure fever dream. She's swallowed by Satan in the form of a dragon, preys inside his stomach, and then bursts out of him unharmed, splitting his body open from the inside. It's grotesque, it's absurd, and it's also kind of metal. And also what? But here's the thing, young girls read these stories, nuns recited them. Widows wept over them, and many, many young women aspired to be like them. Not just to stay virgins, but to be worth that kind of holy suffering. Some even reenacted the pain. There are records of girls wearing chains under their clothes, self-flagellating, fasting to the point of collapse, not out of rebellion, out of devotion, because the message was clear. The highest form of feminine holiness was to be desired and untouched, to be beautiful and inaccessible, to resist so perfectly that even all death couldn't break you. You glance again at the painting of Agatha. Her eyes are too wide, her lips parted just enough to suggest pain or ecstasy. It's hard to tell, and maybe that's the point, because for the medieval audience that line was blurred. Martyrdom was supposed to be horrible, but also inspiring, and also kind of hot. There's one more story that sticks with you. It's about St. Wilgefortis, who was supposedly a princess betrothed to a pagan king. She prayed to escape the marriage, and miraculously grew a beard overnight. Horrified, her would-be husband called it off, and her father had her crucified. In some versions, she's known as the Bearded Virgin, and yes, people venerated her too, especially women trying to avoid forced marriage. It's strange. It's tragic. It's a little bit magnificent. You walk through the chapel side door into the cold night, stars pricking the sky like spilled sand. The stories echo behind you, of girls who bled for refusing to say yes, of bodies torn apart, then canonized, of purity defended with fists clenched and teeth grit. You wonder what they would think, those girls, if they knew their pain would become ritual, that their suffering would be carved into stone, painted on ceilings, read aloud in holy offices, that their refusal to surrender would become the ideal, and you wonder, uncomfortably, if they ever had a choice at all. You're standing behind a tapestry in a royal hall, the kind where sunlight slants through stained glass and illuminates 1,000 dust motes in the air, each one swirling like a secret. The room is opulent. Thick carpets, velvet chairs, carved oak everything. And at the far end, perched on a throne with one elbow resting lazily on the armrest, is a king who looks bored out of his mind. Until she walks in. She's not his queen. She's not even supposed to be here. But the way she glides across the floor, the way the king straightens in his seat just slightly, the way a smirk tugs at the corner of his mouth, it's obvious. You've just walked in on the beginning, or maybe the 100th chapter of a royal affair. And while the stained glass saints look on with judgment, this is how politics really worked. Because behind every law about marriage, chastity and godly living, there was always this. Powerful people doing whatever they wanted, and making the scribes write something entirely different. Tonight you're slipping into the scented shadows of royal bedrooms and the epic lies written to hide or justify their sexual misadventures. Let's start with the obvious. Medieval kings were not known for fidelity. Even the most pious monarchs kept mistresses, lovers and one-night side quests so numerous they could have filled a second court. And the hypocrisy wasn't just tolerated, it was practically built into the job. Royal marriages were for alliances, land, heirs. Love was optional. Loyalty even more so, but here's where it gets theatrical. Because while everyone knew what was going on, the official story always told a different tale. Chronicles, letters, annals, they were the PR teams of the day, massaging royal reputations with the finesse of a court jester tiptoeing through a minefield. Take King Philip IV of France. By all accounts, he was cold, calculating, and incredibly pious. Yet in 1314 he had 3 of his daughters-in-law arrested for adultery in what became known as the Tour de Nesle affair. The evidence, spying, gossip, and some very suspicious gifts being passed between women and their supposed lovers. 2 knights were tortured, confessed, as people tend to do when stretched on a rack, and were publicly executed. The women, imprisoned for life or quietly removed. But the big question was never whether adultery had occurred. It was why Philip cared so much. Unless perhaps it wasn't about sex at all, but dynastic paranoia. That's the twist in so many royal scandals. Sex was often the scapegoat for politics. Adultery could invalidate heirs, discredit rivals, serve as moral justification for wars, executions, or annulments. If you wanted someone gone, just accuse them of sleeping with the wrong person, and let the public imagination do the rest. And here's your fringe fact for tonight. Chroniclers would often clean up royal sex lives in exchange for money, land, or protection. Which means half the saintly reputations of kings and queens. PR fiction. There's even a famous scribe who, after praising a king's chaste and godly nature, was found to have written an entirely different account for a rival noble family in which the same king was a rutting boar drunk on Venus. Talk about a rebrand. You flip through one such chronicle now. On the surface, it's a dry account of a queen's daily routine. Mass, embroidery, chess. But between the lines, in marginalia nearly erased, is a scribbled note. The night was seen leaving her chambers before cockcrow. Her maid wept. No names. Just enough to hint at a scandal no one dared write out loud. And the queens? They had secrets too. Eleanor of Aquitaine, famously bold and politically savvy, was accused of affairs with everyone from her uncle to a Saracen prince. Did she? Probably not. But the rumours alone were enough to colour her entire legend, and they stuck because powerful women always faced a double standard. If they were sexually active, they were dangerous. If they weren't, they were useless. Either way, they were watched more closely than any man. You sit now in the corner of an abandoned solar, flipping through old letters. One is from a royal mistress, anonymous, unsigned, probably dictated to a discreet scribe. "I fear no sin in your arms," it reads. "Only the weight of a crown that is not mine." It's passionate, sad, and entirely out of step with the icy pious king the chronicles claim she loved. Someone somewhere had to make a choice, romantic truth or political necessity. And we know which one ended up in the official records. Here's the scholarly debate, still unresolved. Did the chroniclers lie because they had to, or because they wanted to? Some say they were simply protecting their own necks, writing what the king wanted to hear. Others argue they were true believers, genuinely convinced that royal bodies were sacred, and that to tarnish them with lust would endanger not just the crown, but the divine order itself. Either way, they created a version of history that only told part of the story, the polished part, the part that didn't sweat. But the truth? It's in the gaps, the redacted names, the missing pages, the letters accidentally burned, the hush in the hallway when a servant passes a door he's not supposed to know about. And in those gaps, you find real people. Lonely kings, defiant queens, servants who loved them, lovers who disappeared, children with questionable parentage, bastards with more honour than their titled fathers, passion that burned so hot it had to be buried under 3 layers of ink and 50 years of silence. You step back out into the hallway as a servant glides past with a goblet of wine, eyes down. Behind a closed door you hear laughter, low, intimate, dangerous. And you know that tomorrow the official story will say the king spent the evening in prayer. Because the final brutal truth of royal sex in the medieval world is this: what happened didn't matter nearly as much as what people were told had happened. And history, like love, is always written by the one with the better quill. You're back in the council hall, the air thick with candle smoke and something more acrid, sweat maybe, or frustration. The walls are lined with serious men in serious robes, all gathered around a long table cluttered with parchment, ink pots, and the half-eaten remains of a midday meal. A bishop clears his throat, a scribe dips his quill, and the magistrate at the head of the table exhales deeply and says what they're all thinking. We can't punish them all. The city would be empty. You've stumbled into a meeting that might as well be happening behind every cathedral manor and courtroom wall in Europe. The topic? Sex. Again and still, always. More specifically, what to do about the fact that no one is following the rules. Here's the core problem, laid out like a confession. Medieval sex laws were detailed, rigid, and deeply moralistic, but completely unenforceable at scale. Whether it was fornication, adultery, sodomy, prostitution, or impure thoughts during Mass, people just kept doing the things they weren't supposed to do, sometimes quietly, sometimes flamboyantly, sometimes in the confessional booth between verses of a hymn. And the church, the state, they couldn't keep up. So now you're watching the lawmakers admit what everyone else already knows. The laws don't work. Not really, not for everyone. One council member, a priest with a thin voice and ink-stained fingers, flips through a list of recent punishments. We fined 4 women last week for wearing silks to entice men. One's husband is a bishop. Murmurs ripple across the table. Someone snorts. Another mutters, enticement is relative. They all laugh, but it's the laugh of tired men who've seen this cycle too many times. They go down the list. A nobleman caught with a stable boy, paid a fine and donated a new altar. A nun pregnant by a visiting monk, transferred and quietly confessed. A midwife accused of selling love charms, scolded, but too valuable to imprison. A widow with 3 lovers, humiliated in public, then offered protection by a city official who apparently enjoyed her company. The contradictions are everywhere. You glance at a parchment nailed to the door outside, no intercourse on holy days. That rules out over half the calendar. Then there's the long-standing list of forbidden positions, only one of which is officially sanctioned by the church. Missionary, eyes up, no noise. You remember the sin registers from earlier sections, hundreds of variations on thou shalt not, and yet here we are, centuries later, and the scribes are still trying to make sense of it all. One man at the table finally breaks the philosophical surface. Why do we bother, he asks, not sarcastically, but genuinely tired. Why outlaw desire when it keeps coming back like weeds through stone? The room falls quiet. It's the kind of question you're not supposed to ask in a room full of robes and rings, but it lands. Because here's the truth they won't say aloud. The rules were never designed to be fully obeyed. They were designed to be known, to cast a shadow, to remind everyone that their bodies were suspect, their thoughts under surveillance, their pleasure always in debt to a higher authority. Enforcement wasn't about wiping out sin. It was about control, and that's your fringe fact tonight. Many medieval penitential manuals advise priests to focus more on visible sins than hidden ones. Not because the hidden ones were less severe, but because chasing them all would collapse the system. They knew people were sinning in silence. They just couldn't afford to look too closely. The open scholarly debate here is as hotly contested as the sins themselves. Were medieval sexual laws sincerely believed by the authorities or just tools of power? Were bishops agonising over how to save souls or simply trying to maintain the hierarchy? Probably both, probably neither. Probably it depends on the year, the city, the pope's mood, the political needs of the day. Outside the council room you follow a clerk through the side halls, passing a couple pressed against a pillar, in a shadowed corner. They freeze when they see you, half guilty, half defiant. Their hands part, but their eyes don't. A breathless laugh escapes. You nod and keep walking. Who are you to judge? In another chamber you pass a guard chatting with a young servant girl, his hand resting lightly, casually on her hip. She doesn't flinch, she just leans in a little. It's a world where lines blur constantly, where rules are spoken louder than they're lived. And eventually you realise what this whole hidden history has been circling around. There was never one medieval sexuality. There was the official story, chastity, control, punishment, and then there was everything else. The hidden letters, the wink across the market, the priest who slipped up, the nun who kissed back, the lovers who didn't get caught. The people who loved quietly, or badly, or brilliantly. The rules said no, the bodies said yes. You return to the council room just as the bishop is wrapping up. Let us revise the fine system, he says, exasperated. Perhaps make adultery cost more than a loaf of bread. The scribe jots it down dutifully. You can already tell it won't matter. There's laughter in the hallways, music drifting up from the kitchens. Somewhere nearby, a pair of shoes are being kicked under a bed. And you, dear traveller, have spent this journey peering through the veil of rules to see what actually happened behind the altar, under the hayloft, between the margins of history. In the end, the laws fail to rule because desire doesn't read legal documents. It doesn't care what day of the week it is. It doesn't care if you're married or cloistered or crowned. It just hums quietly under your skin, waiting for the right moment to slip past the guardrail. The church kept writing new rules. The people kept finding new ways to ignore them. And for every scandal punished, a dozen more went unwritten, hidden in whispers, sealed in a memory, or inked into the back page of a prayer book. And that, you realise, is the real story. So now you're back in your own bed, maybe a little warmer than before, maybe your head a bit heavier, with everything you've just walked through. You started this journey thinking it would be about laws, about strict rules, forbidden acts, maybe a few punishments that seemed quaint from the safety of modern hindsight. What you got was messier, wilder, more human, because that's what history really is, right? Not just the sermons and scrolls and official proclamations, but the space between them, the hidden letters, the smudged margins, the priest sneaking glances during Mass, the peasant girl burying a love charm beneath her crush's threshold, the queen lying awake next to a king she never chose. The rules were loud, but real life whispered louder. You've seen the contradictions carved into every corner of medieval life. Virgin saints bleeding into sainthood, nuns scribbling secret poems, public shame turning into small-town theatre, crusaders bringing both relics and brothels to the Holy Land. You've followed scholars and scribes as they tried to paper over desire with theology, and you've watched as lovers kept finding each other anyway, beneath the gaze of angels, beside the threat of pain. And now, in this quiet modern moment, you get to hold it all. The purity and the scandal, the guilt and the giggles, the laws that wanted to control people and the people who refused to be controlled. History didn't forget them. It just buried them under better stories. Tonight, you dug them back up. So exhale, let it go. The past can be heavy, but it can also be honest. You made it to the end. And despite everything we just talked about, you probably would have survived it. Well, maybe.